A philosopher lives in a jar and tells the most powerful man in the world to move. Another is executed for asking questions the city didn't want answered. A cult discovers irrational numbers and drowns the one who revealed it. Someone proves you can never catch a tortoise. Another claims he's been a bush, a bird, and a fish in his past lives. And these are just the ones we know about. Most of Greek philosophy is gone, burned, lost, forgotten. What survived are fragments, rumors, and legends that grow stranger the deeper you go. Tonight, we're going through all of it. The classics you've heard of, the forgotten ones you haven't, and the mysteries at the bottom that nobody can solve. The mystery of Pythagoras' cult. Pythagoras of Samos is one of the strangest figures in ancient Greek philosophy. Born around 570 BCE, he eventually settled in southern Italy and founded what can only be described as a secret society that blended mathematics, religion, and philosophy in ways that seem bizarre, even by ancient standards. Here's the peculiar thing about Pythagoras. He never wrote anything down, not a single word. Everything we know about him comes from sources written hundreds of years after his death. Aristotle, writing about a century later, doesn't even talk about Pythagoras directly. He refers to the Pythagoreans as a group. The detailed biographies we have were written more than 700 years after Pythagoras died, which means separating fact from legend is nearly impossible. What we do know is that Pythagoras founded a community in Croton that operated under strict rules and maintained absolute secrecy. Members were divided into two groups. The inner circle lived permanently in the community, shared all property, and had access to the master's secret teachings. The outer circle lived in their own homes and could only attend daytime lectures. If you wanted the real knowledge, you had to give up everything and commit completely. The community followed a bizarre set of rules that governed every aspect of daily life. The most famous is the prohibition against eating beans. Ancient sources offer wildly different explanations for this. Some claimed Pythagoras believed beans contained the souls of the dead. Others said beans resembled the gates of Hades. Aristotle, more practically, suggested that Pythagoras forbade beans because they cause flatulence, which disturbs philosophical concentration. Modern scholars have pointed out that some people of Mediterranean descent have a genetic condition that causes severe allergic reactions to fava beans. Maybe Pythagoras had this condition and generalized from his own experience. But beans were just the beginning. Members couldn't pick up anything that had fallen. They couldn't stir fire with iron. They couldn't look in a mirror beside a light. They couldn't walk on highways. They had to smooth out the impression their bodies left in bed when they got up. They couldn't eat white roosters. They couldn't break bread. They had to put on the right shoe before the left. These rules were called acousmata, things heard, and they were passed down without explanation. You either followed them or you didn't belong. The philosophical core of Pythagoreanism was the belief in metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls. Pythagoras claimed he could remember his past lives. He said he had been a warrior at Troy, then a prophet, then a fisherman, and finally Pythagoras. This belief extended to animals, which is why the community was vegetarian. Pythagoras once heard a dog barking and claimed to recognize the voice of a dead friend. Whether he was serious or making a point about the unity of life is impossible to say. The Pythagoreans made genuine mathematical discoveries that transformed Greek thought. The Pythagorean theorem that in a right triangle the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other sides may have been known to Babylonian mathematicians earlier, but the Pythagoreans apparently proved it rigorously. They discovered that musical intervals correspond to simple numerical ratios. An octave is 2 to 1, a fifth is 3 to 2, a fourth is 4 to 3. These discoveries led them to a radical conclusion. Number is the fundamental principle of reality. Everything that exists can be understood through number and proportion. The cosmos itself is mathematical. They associated specific numbers with concepts. 1 is the point, 2 is the line, 3 is the surface, 4 is the solid 10 was sacred because it equals the sum of 1, 2, 3, and 4, and could be represented as a triangle of dots. Then disaster struck. They discovered irrational numbers. Someone in the community, possibly a member named Hippasus, proved that the diagonal of a square with sides of length 1 cannot be expressed as a ratio of whole numbers. This contradicted everything they believed. If all reality is number, and number means ratios of integers, then what is this thing that cannot be expressed as a ratio? The discovery was kept secret within the community. According to legend, Hippasus was drowned at sea as punishment for revealing it to outsiders. Whether this actually happened is doubtful, but the story reflects how seriously the Pythagoreans took their mathematical mysticism. The community's political activities led to its destruction. The Pythagoreans in Croton became involved in local politics, generally supporting aristocratic factions. Around 500 BCE, a democratic uprising targeted them. The Democrats set fire to the house where the Pythagoreans were meeting. Most died in the flames. Sources disagree about whether Pythagoras himself died in this attack or escaped and died shortly afterward, possibly by voluntary starvation. Despite this violent suppression, Pythagorean communities continued to exist for centuries. They influenced Plato enormously. His emphasis on mathematics as the key to understanding reality, his theory of forms as eternal and unchanging like mathematical truths, his view of philosophy as a way of life rather than just intellectual exercise. All of this shows Pythagorean influence. The mystery of Pythagoras remains. Was he a mathematician who made genuine discoveries, a religious prophet who founded a cult, a charlatan who exploited people's desire for secret knowledge? The ancient sources disagree, and the complete lack of any writings from Pythagoras himself means we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that this strange community that wouldn't eat beans and believed in reincarnation also helped create the foundation of Western mathematics. That combination of mysticism and rigorous logic is what makes Pythagoras so fascinating and so strange. Diogenes living in a barrel. Diogenes of Sinope lived from about 412 to 323 BCE and became famous for living in a large ceramic storage jar in the marketplace of Athens. Popular accounts call it a barrel, but it was actually a pythos, the kind of huge jar Greeks used for storing wine or grain. He owned nothing except a cloak, a walking stick, and a bag for food, and he lived this way by choice. Diogenes arrived in Athens as an exile. The story goes that his father was a banker in Sinope who got caught defacing the currency, and Diogenes was somehow involved. Whether this literally happened, or whether defacing the currency was a metaphor for challenging accepted values, nobody knows. Either way, he ended up in Athens with nothing. He became a student of Antisthenes, who had studied under Socrates. Antisthenes taught that virtue is about action, not theory, and that the wise person is self-sufficient and doesn't need what society says you need. Diogenes took this idea and ran with it to its logical extreme. If society creates unnecessary suffering and the wise person needs only the bare necessities, then throw everything else away, live with absolute simplicity. So he moved into a storage jar in the marketplace. He performed all bodily functions in public. When people objected to him masturbating in the agora, he said he wished he could satisfy hunger by rubbing his belly. This wasn't just provocation, it was philosophy in action. Natural functions aren't shameful. Society creates artificial shame. A philosopher who lives according to nature should do natural things without embarrassment, the way dogs do. The comparison to dogs is important. The word cynic comes from the Greek word for dog-like. Diogenes called himself a dog and was proud of it. Dogs live simply, follow their nature, can tell friends from enemies, and have no pretenses. These are virtues, not insults. The stories about Diogenes are legendary. When Plato defined a human as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken and brought it to Plato's academy. Announcing he'd brought a human, Plato had to add, with broad flat nails, to his definition. Point made. Clever definitions don't capture reality. The most famous story involves Alexander the Great. When Alexander visited Corinth, he sought out Diogenes and found him lying in the sun. Alexander introduced himself and asked if there was anything he could do for the philosopher. Diogenes told him to step out of his sunlight. Alexander's companions mocked Diogenes after they left. But Alexander reportedly said that if he weren't Alexander, he would want to be Diogenes. The story might be invented, but it captures something true about cynic philosophy. All the power and wealth in the world means nothing compared to freedom from need. Diogenes carried a lamp in broad daylight, claiming to be looking for an honest person. The gesture mocked Athenian pretensions. Citizens prided themselves on their virtue while being as greedy and dishonest as everyone else. The philosopher's job was to expose this hypocrisy by living with complete honesty. At some point, pirates captured Diogenes and sold him into slavery. When asked what he could do, he said he could govern men and should be sold to someone who needed a master. A man named Xeniades bought him and put him in charge of his household and his son's education. Diogenes apparently lived with this family for the rest of his life, though whether he was technically a slave is unclear. His death generated multiple stories. Some say he held his breath until he died. Others say he ate raw octopus and got sick. Another version claims he died from an infected dog bite, which would be perfectly appropriate for a cynic. He was buried in Corinth, and the city put up a pillar with a marble dog on top. The philosophical point behind all this strange behavior was simple. Humans suffer because they think they need things they don't actually need. Reputation, wealth, comfort, success. All of this creates anxiety and dependence. The person who needs nothing can't be threatened, can't be controlled, can't be disappointed. That's real freedom. The wise person recognizes that virtue, meaning knowledge of how to live according to nature, is the only real good. Everything else is indifferent. This influenced the Stoics significantly. Zeno of Citium studied Cynic philosophy before founding Stoicism. The Stoic emphasis on distinguishing what's in your control from what isn't, and achieving peace by only desiring what you control, comes partly from cynic teaching. Diogenes wrote dialogues and philosophical works, but they're all lost. We only know him through anecdotes recorded centuries later, which may be embellished or entirely invented, but even if half the stories are fiction, they reveal something real. Diogenes showed that it's possible to live with radical freedom by giving up what society insists you need. Whether sleeping in a jar and urinating in public was the best way to make that point is debatable, but he made the point, and people are still talking about it more than 2,000 years later. Socrates' last day and the Hemlock. In 399 BCE, Athens put Socrates on trial for impiety and corrupting the youth. He was 70 years old. The trial, conviction, and execution of Socrates became one of the most important events in Western philosophy, and Plato's account of his final day remains one of the most powerful texts in the tradition. Socrates had spent decades walking around Athens, questioning people about virtue, knowledge, and justice. His method was to claim ignorance and ask questions that revealed contradictions in what people believed young Athenians loved watching him expose their elders' ignorance. The elders were less amused. The charges were that he didn't recognize the city's gods, that he introduced new divine beings, and that he corrupted young people. The first charge probably referred to his daimonion, a divine voice that warned him against certain actions. The second charge was likely about his association with several young men who later opposed Athenian democracy, particularly Alcibiades and Critias. Context matters here. Athens had recently lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. The city had suffered under the 30 tyrants, an oligarchic regime that killed more than 5% of the population. In 8 months, democracy had been restored only 4 years before the trial. Critias had been one of the 30 tyrants. The charges against Socrates may have been a way to punish him for his students' crimes without violating the general amnesty. 500 Athenian citizens served as the jury. According to Plato's Apology, Socrates didn't apologize. Instead, he defended his philosophical activity as a service to Athens. He compared himself to a gadfly stinging a lazy horse. Athens needed someone to question and challenge its citizens. He claimed he was following a divine mission. The oracle at Delphi had said no one was wiser than Socrates, which he interpreted to mean he was wise because he knew he was ignorant while others falsely thought they knew things. The jury found him guilty by maybe 30 votes out of 500. Under Athenian law, the prosecutor proposed a penalty, and the defendant proposed an alternative. The jury chose between them. The prosecutor proposed death. Socrates needed to propose something the jury would accept instead. His response was characteristically confrontational. He said Athens should reward him with free meals in the Prytaneum, an honor for Olympic victors and public benefactors. After his friends urged him to propose something realistic, he offered to pay a small fine. The jury voted again and sentenced him to death, this time by a larger margin. Athenian law required a delay because of a religious festival. No executions could happen between when a sacred ship departed for Delos and when it returned. This took about a month. Socrates stayed in prison. His friends arranged an escape. Crito explained that a ship was ready, the guards were bribed, everything was prepared. Crito argued that Socrates had obligations to his children, and that his death would make his friends look bad. Socrates refused. In Plato's dialogue, Crito, he argued that escaping would be wrong. It would harm the city by undermining its laws. He personified the laws and imagined them arguing that they had benefited him his entire life. They enabled his parents to marry, ensured his education, protected him. He chose to remain in Athens as an adult, which was an implicit agreement to obey its laws. Breaking that agreement now would be unjust. Plato's Phaedo describes the final day. Friends gathered at dawn. The guard announced the poison would come that evening. Socrates spent the day discussing whether the soul is immortal. As evening approached, he bathed so the women wouldn't have to wash his corpse. He said goodbye to his wife and 3 sons. The executioner brought the cup of hemlock and explained that Socrates should drink it, walk around until his legs felt heavy, then lie down. Hemlock causes death through paralysis. It starts in the extremities and moves toward the vital organs. When it reaches the diaphragm and breathing stops, death occurs. The ancient accounts say it's painless if you stay calm. Socrates drank without hesitation. He walked around, then lay down. His friends began crying. He told them he'd sent the women away to avoid this kind of display. The executioner periodically pressed Socrates' feet and legs to check the poison's progress. His last words were, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay the debt and don't neglect it." This has generated endless interpretation. Asclepius was the god of healing. You offered him a rooster after recovering from illness. Some think Socrates meant death is a cure, a release from mortal life. Others think he was just remembering an actual debt. The ambiguity is typical of Socrates. Plato ends the Phaedo by calling Socrates the best, wisest, and most just person he'd known. The execution became a defining moment for philosophy. It showed the potential conflict between philosophy and political authority. It established the philosopher as someone willing to die for principles. It raised questions about justice, law, and civil disobedience that we still debate. Plato's Cave Allegory. The allegory of the cave appears in Book 7 of Plato's Republic, written around 380 BCE. The Republic is about justice, but the cave allegory deals with reality and knowledge, exploring what's actually real and how we can know it. Socrates asks Glaucon to imagine prisoners chained in a cave since childhood. The chains fix their legs and necks so they can't move or turn their heads. They face a wall. Behind them burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners is a raised walkway where people carry objects, casting shadows on the wall the prisoners face. The prisoners see only shadows. They can't see the objects, can't see the fire, can't see each other, can't turn around. The shadows are their entire reality. They name the shadows. They notice patterns. Some prisoners become expert at predicting which shadows will appear next. These experts receive honor for their knowledge. Socrates asks, what would happen if a prisoner were freed? First, turning his head would be painful because his muscles would be stiff. He'd see the fire, and the light would hurt. He'd see the objects being carried, but they'd seem less real than the shadows he's watched his entire life. If someone told him the objects are real and the shadows are just reflections, he wouldn't believe it. The shadows are more real because they're familiar. If the freed prisoner were dragged up out of the cave into sunlight, the experience would be traumatic. The sun would blind him. He couldn't see anything at first. Gradually, his eyes would adjust. He'd first look at shadows and reflections in water, then at objects themselves, eventually at the stars and moon, finally at the sun itself, understanding that the sun is the source of light and governs everything visible. The freed prisoner would pity those still in the cave. He'd remember the honors given to shadow prediction experts, and they'd seem worthless now. He wouldn't want to return to that life. But if he did return, he'd face new problems. His eyes, adjusted to sunlight, wouldn't work well in darkness. He'd perform poorly at shadow prediction. The other prisoners would mock him, saying his journey ruined his sight. If he tried to free them, they'd resist. If they could, they'd kill him. Socrates explains the meaning. The cave represents the visible world we perceive through our senses. The journey upward represents the soul's ascent to the intelligible realm, the realm of forms. The sun represents the form of the good, which is the highest form and the source of knowledge and truth. Just as the sun makes vision possible by providing light, the form of the good makes understanding possible. The prisoners represent ordinary people who trust their senses and think the physical world is all there is. The shadows represent images and appearances that most people mistake for reality. The objects on the walkway represent physical objects, which are more real than shadows, but are still imperfect copies of forms. The freed prisoner represents the philosopher who, through education, comes to understand the forms and ultimately the form of the good. This connects to Plato's theory of forms. Physical objects we perceive are imperfect, temporary copies of eternal, unchanging forms. The form of a chair is the perfect, eternal pattern that all physical chairs imperfectly copy. Physical chairs can be damaged or destroyed, but the form of a chair exists eternally in the intelligible realm. The forms are organized hierarchically with the form of the good at the top. The form of the good is like the sun, providing the illumination necessary for knowledge. Just as eyes need light to see, the intellect needs the form of the good to understand other forms. It's the source of truth and knowledge. The allegory also addresses politics. The freed prisoner who returns represents the philosopher who returns to political life. Plato argues that philosophers have an obligation to return to govern. Even though they'd prefer to contemplate the forms, the mockery the returned prisoner receives, and the danger he might be killed, reflects what happened to Socrates. The education required to escape the cave is lengthy. In the Republic, Socrates proposes that future rulers study mathematics from 20 to 30, training their minds to think about abstract, eternal objects rather than physical, changeable things. From 30 to 35, they should study dialectic, philosophical conversation that examines assumptions through rigorous argument. Only then should they be permitted to rule. The cave allegory has influenced Western thought far beyond philosophy. Christians interpreted it as the soul's ascent to God. Renaissance humanists used it to argue for education's importance. Modern film and literature reference it constantly. The Matrix films explicitly present a version where humans live in simulated reality while their bodies remain imprisoned. Critics have questioned whether forms actually exist. Aristotle rejected the theory as unnecessary. He argued that universals exist in particular things, not in a separate realm. Modern nominalists say universals don't exist at all, that only particular things exist, and words like chair are just names we apply to collections that resemble each other. But the epistemological question remains relevant. How do we distinguish appearance from reality? How do we know whether our perceptions correspond to what actually exists? Science constantly discovers that reality differs from appearance. Atoms are mostly empty space. Time passes at different rates depending on velocity and gravity. The universe is expanding. In each case, careful investigation reveals that reality differs significantly from ordinary perception. Maybe Plato was onto something. The Paradoxes of Zeno. Zeno of Elea, born around 490 BCE, created a series of paradoxes that made people question everything they thought they knew about motion, space, and time. These weren't just clever puzzles. They were serious philosophical arguments that philosophers and mathematicians are still discussing today. Zeno was a student of Parmenides, who had argued that change is impossible, and reality is actually a single, unchanging, eternal thing. This sounded crazy because obviously things change and move all the time. Zeno's paradoxes were designed to show that the common sense belief in motion actually leads to logical contradictions. If you can't explain how motion is possible without contradicting yourself, maybe Parmenides was right. According to Aristotle, who's our main source for this, Zeno wrote a book with 40 paradoxes. Most are lost. We have detailed accounts of only a few. The four most famous all concern motion. The dichotomy paradox goes like this. Say you want to walk from point A to point B. Before you can get to B, you have to get halfway there. But before you can get halfway there, you have to get a quarter of the way there. And before that, an eighth of the way. This continues infinitely. You have to complete an infinite number of tasks before you can even start moving. Since you can't complete an infinite number of tasks, motion can't begin. There's a second version that runs the argument in reverse. To get from A to B, you first have to cover half the distance, then half of what remains, then half of what remains after that. Continuing forever, you have to complete an infinite series. Since an infinite series can't be completed, you can never actually reach B. The paradox of Achilles and the tortoise tells the same story in a more memorable way. Achilles, the fastest runner in Greek mythology, races a tortoise. The tortoise gets a head start. Zeno argues that Achilles can never overtake the tortoise. By the time Achilles reaches where the tortoise started, the tortoise has moved forward. By the time Achilles reaches that new point, the tortoise has moved further. This continues forever. Achilles gets closer and closer but can never actually pass. The arrow paradox takes a different approach. Consider an arrow flying through the air. At any single instant in time, the arrow occupies a space exactly equal to its length. It's not moving into a different space because an instant has no duration. At this instant, the arrow looks exactly like a stationary arrow. If the arrow isn't moving at any instant, and time is made up entirely of instants, then the arrow is never actually moving. The stadium paradox is more complicated and harder to interpret from the ancient descriptions. It involves 3 rows of objects, 1 stationary, and 2 moving past it in opposite directions. At the same speed, Zeno apparently argued this leads to contradictory conclusions about how much time has passed and how much distance the moving rows have covered. These paradoxes created real problems for ancient Greek thought. The Greeks generally believed that space and time are infinitely divisible. Any distance can be cut in half, and each half can be cut again, forever. Zeno showed that this assumption creates logical problems when combined with the reality of motion. Ancient philosophers tried various responses. Some argued that completing an infinite series isn't necessarily impossible if the terms get progressively smaller. Modern mathematics supports this through convergent infinite series. 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16, and so on actually equals 1, even though the series has infinitely many terms. So maybe you can complete these infinite tasks because each one takes less time. Aristotle distinguished between potential infinity and actual infinity. A line is potentially infinitely divisible because you can always divide it further, but you never actually make infinitely many divisions. Motion doesn't require completing infinitely many actual divisions, just traversing a distance that could potentially be divided. Whether this fully answers Zeno is debatable. The arrow paradox raises different issues. It forces a choice. If time consists of indivisible instants, motion at an instant seems impossible, which makes all motion impossible. If instants have duration, they're not truly instants, but are made up of shorter intervals, which leads back to infinite divisibility. Some modern philosophers argue that motion is a property of objects over intervals of time, not at instants. An object is moving during an interval if it occupies different positions at different times within that interval. This treats motion as fundamental, rather than trying to build it up from static positions. Zeno's paradoxes anticipated ideas in modern mathematics and physics. The development of calculus in the 17th century by Newton and Leibniz provided mathematical tools for handling infinitesimals and infinite series. Calculus allows rigorous calculation with infinitely many infinitesimally small quantities, something Greek mathematics couldn't do. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that space and time might not be infinitely divisible, but might come in minimum units, like pixels in a digital image. If space consists of discrete minimal units, motion wouldn't involve traversing infinitely many points. This would resolve Zeno's paradoxes by rejecting one of their key assumptions, but whether space and time are actually quantized remains an open question in physics. The paradoxes also raise questions about the relationship between mathematical descriptions and physical reality. Mathematics can describe ideal objects like geometric points with no extension or perfectly sharp instants with no duration. Physical reality might not contain such ideal entities. This gap between mathematical idealization and physical reality might be where Zeno's paradoxes get their power. What's remarkable is that everyone knows motion happens. Arrows fly, runners race, people walk around. Yet when you try to explain precisely how motion is possible, you run into these deep conceptual difficulties. That's what makes Zeno's paradoxes so enduring. They show that obvious experiential fact and conceptual explanation can come apart in troubling ways. Aristotle tutoring Alexander the Great. In 343 BCE, Philip II of Macedon invited Aristotle to tutor his 13-year-old son, Alexander. Aristotle was 38 and had spent 20 years at Plato's academy in Athens. He'd left Athens 3 years earlier, after Plato died, possibly because he disagreed with the new leadership or because anti-Macedonian feelings made his position uncomfortable. Philip made it worth Aristotle's while. According to some sources, Philip agreed to rebuild Aristotle's hometown of Stagira, which Philip had destroyed during his military campaigns. The position also gave Aristotle the chance to shape the education of the future king of Macedon, who would become the most powerful man in the Greek world. The tutoring took place at Mysa, a town in the foothills where Philip had a sanctuary converted into a school. Alexander studied alongside other sons of Macedonian nobility, including Hephaestion, who became his closest friend, Ptolemy, who later ruled Egypt, and Cassander, who eventually killed Alexander's widow and sons. What did Aristotle teach? We know he taught literature, especially Homer. Alexander carried a copy of the Iliad throughout his campaigns. Reportedly sleeping with it under his pillow, alongside a dagger, Aristotle had prepared this copy personally, and it became known as the Iliad of the Casket because Alexander kept it in a jeweled box taken from Persian treasure. Aristotle taught ethics and politics. His views appear in his Nicomachean Ethics and Politics, though these were written later. He taught that the highest human good is eudaimonia, flourishing or happiness, achieved through a life of virtuous activity guided by reason. He distinguished between theoretical wisdom about eternal truths and practical wisdom about how to act well in particular circumstances. His political teaching emphasized that humans are naturally political animals who reach their full potential only within a polis, a city-state. The best form of government depends on circumstances, but generally, aristocracy or constitutional republic works better than monarchy or democracy. These views seem ironic given that Alexander would destroy Greek city-state independence and establish absolute monarchy over a vast empire, doing the opposite of what Aristotle's philosophy would seem to recommend. Aristotle taught natural philosophy, what we call science. He had deep interest in biology and had conducted extensive research on animals, particularly marine life. He taught that the natural world operates according to regular principles that can be understood through observation and reason. He rejected Plato's theory of forms and argued that form and matter are inseparable in physical objects. The tutoring relationship lasted about 3 years. In 340 BCE, when Alexander was 16, Philip appointed him regent, while Philip campaigned elsewhere. This ended Alexander's formal education. Alexander successfully put down a rebellion and founded his first city, Alexandropolis. After the tutoring ended, Aristotle didn't immediately return to Athens. He spent several years in Asia Minor, conducting biological research, and possibly advising rulers allied with Macedon. He returned to Athens in 335 BCE after Alexander had become king, and founded his own school, the Lyceum. The relationship between Aristotle and Alexander after the tutoring period is murky. Some sources suggest they stayed in contact. Aristotle reportedly sent Alexander advice on governing conquered territories. Other sources claim Alexander sent biological specimens back to Aristotle from his campaigns. Pliny states that Alexander ordered thousands of men to collect animal information for Aristotle, though this sounds exaggerated. But there's also evidence of estrangement. Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his claim to divine honors offended traditional Greek sensibilities. probably including Aristotle's nephew Callisthenes accompanied Alexander's expedition as official historian. Callisthenes openly criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian practices and refused to perform proskynesis, prostrating before the king. When a conspiracy against Alexander was discovered, Alexander accused Callisthenes of involvement. Callisthenes was arrested and died in custody. This event likely damaged the relationship between Aristotle and Alexander. Aristotle had recommended Callisthenes for the position. Callisthenes' death could be seen as betrayal of Aristotle's trust. No evidence exists of further communication after this. The influence of Aristotle's teaching on Alexander's actions is debatable. Alexander's treatment of conquered peoples showed some restraint by ancient standards. He generally honored local customs and religious practices. He founded cities throughout his empire that spread Greek culture. These policies might reflect Aristotle's teachings about human commonality and Greek civilization's value. However, Alexander also acted in ways that contradicted Aristotelian philosophy. He destroyed Thebes completely in 335 BCE, killing thousands and enslaving survivors. His claim to divine parentage and demand that Greeks worship him as a god violated Greek norms that Aristotle defended. His establishment of absolute monarchy over a vast empire contradicted Aristotle's political philosophy favoring smaller city-states with mixed constitutions. Modern historians generally conclude that while Aristotle shaped Alexander's intellectual development and instilled love of Greek literature and learning, Alexander's actions as king were driven primarily by political and military considerations, rather than philosophical principles. The relationship between philosopher and ruler rarely follows a simple pattern of teacher and obedient student. After Alexander died in 323 BCE, anti-Macedonian feeling in Athens intensified. Aristotle faced charges of impiety, like those that led to Socrates' execution. Rather than face trial, Aristotle fled Athens, reportedly saying he wouldn't let Athens sin twice against philosophy. He died in exile the following year at 62. The question of whether philosophy can guide political power finds a partial answer in Aristotle and Alexander's relationship. A brilliant philosopher taught a supremely gifted student who became the most powerful ruler of his age. Yet the student's actions often contradicted the teacher's principles. This suggests limits to philosophy's ability to shape political reality, limits that both ancient and modern political philosophers continue to face. Epicurus's Garden of Pleasure. Epicurus founded his philosophical school in Athens around 307 BCE in a house with a garden. The garden became one of the four major philosophical schools in Athens, alongside Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, and the Stoa, where Stoics taught. But unlike those schools, the garden operated as a private community. Epicurus was born in 341 BCE on Samos. He studied with various teachers before moving to Athens. By the time he founded the garden, he'd developed a comprehensive philosophical system covering physics, knowledge, and ethics. The physical setup mattered. The school met on private property, not in public spaces or city-provided buildings. This reflected Epicurean philosophy, which advised withdrawal from public life. Epicurus taught that political involvement brings anxiety and conflict without producing genuine happiness. The wise person lives quietly among friends, avoiding political turbulence. The garden did something unusual for ancient schools. It admitted women and slaves as students and members. Leontian, a courtesan, became a prominent member and wrote philosophical works criticizing other philosophers, particularly Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor. Her writings haven't survived, but ancient sources confirm they existed. The inclusion of women and slaves reflected the Epicurean principle that philosophy is universally accessible and beneficial. The community shared meals and celebrated certain days each month in honor of Epicurus and his close associates. These celebrations involved simple food and philosophical discussion. Epicurus reportedly lived on bread, water, and occasionally cheese. This frugality wasn't asceticism for its own sake, but practical wisdom. By training yourself to be satisfied with simple pleasures, you become less vulnerable to fortune. The person who needs only bread and water to be happy can't suffer much from poverty. Epicurean philosophy started with atomistic physics derived from Democritus. Epicurus taught that reality consists entirely of atoms and void. Atoms are indivisible particles moving through empty space, colliding and combining to form everything observable, including human bodies and souls. When a person dies, the atoms scatter and recombine in other forms. There's no immortal soul, no afterlife, no divine judgment. This physics served an ethical purpose. Fear of death and divine punishment cause much human misery. If death is simply atomic dissolution, nothing to be experienced because no consciousness survives, then fearing death is irrational. Epicurus wrote that death is nothing to us, because when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we don't exist. Regarding gods, Epicurus didn't deny their existence, but denied they concern themselves with human affairs. The gods exist in perfect happiness in spaces between worlds. Interfering in human affairs would disturb their tranquility. They neither reward virtue nor punish vice. Religious rituals may be performed as cultural practices, but they have no practical effect. This removed another major source of anxiety. The goal of life, according to Epicurus, is pleasure. This made Epicureanism controversial and continues to be misunderstood. Epicurus defined pleasure as absence of pain in the body and disturbance in the soul, a state called ataraxia, tranquility. This isn't continuous sensual indulgence, but the pleasure of a peaceful mind and body free from suffering. Epicurus distinguished between necessary and unnecessary desires. Necessary desires are those whose satisfaction removes pain, hunger, thirst, shelter. These should be satisfied simply. Unnecessary desires like luxury food, expensive clothing, fame, or power have no natural limit. Pursuing them creates endless striving and inevitable disappointment. The wise person satisfies necessary desires simply and ignores unnecessary ones. Within unnecessary desires, he distinguished between natural but unnecessary desires, like sexual pleasure or varied food, and unnatural and unnecessary desires, like fame or immortality. Natural but unnecessary desires may be pursued if easily satisfied and don't lead to pain, but not compulsively. Unnatural and unnecessary desires should be eliminated entirely because they can never be satisfied. Friendship held special importance. Epicurus taught that friendship is the greatest source of happiness. The garden functioned as a community of friends, living together and supporting each other. Numerous fragments emphasize this. He wrote that we must meditate on things that produce happiness, because if we have happiness, we have everything, but if we lack it, we do everything to possess it. The Epicurean understanding of pleasure as tranquility, rather than positive sensation, required moderation and self-control. Drinking heavily might produce temporary pleasure, but the hangover and risk of alcoholism produce more pain. Wise calculation considers long-term consequences. This made Epicureanism compatible with generally conventional behavior, despite its reputation for advocating pleasure. Epicurus wrote approximately 300 scrolls. Nearly all are lost. The primary surviving works are 3 letters preserved by Diogenes Laertius: the letter to Herodotus on physics, the letter to Pythagoras on meteorology and astronomy, and the letter to Menocius on ethics. A collection of maxims called the Principal Doctrines survives, plus another collection discovered in the Vatican Library. The Roman poet Lucretius wrote on the nature of things in the 1st century BCE as an exposition of Epicurean philosophy in Latin verse. This preserved much Epicurean physics that would otherwise be lost. When the poem was rediscovered in 1417, it influenced Renaissance thinkers significantly. Epicureanism faced criticism from other schools. Stoics objected that withdrawing from public life was irresponsible and that pleasure, even defined as tranquility, wasn't the proper goal. They argued that virtue is the only good. Christians later attacked Epicureanism for denying divine providence and for apparent advocacy of pleasure, though Christian critics often misrepresented Epicurean philosophy as simple hedonism. Epicurus suffered from painful kidney stones for years before dying in 270 BCE at 72. In his last letter, written the day he died, he reported experiencing extreme pain, yet he was still happy because he was reflecting on philosophical conversations with friends. This exemplifies the Epicurean claim that mental pleasure can outweigh physical pain and that philosophy provides consolation even in extreme suffering. The garden continued after Epicurus died, led by successive heads. Unlike the Academy, which abandoned many of Plato's doctrines, the Epicurean school maintained orthodoxy, treating Epicurus's teachings as essentially complete and correct. The school persisted until at least the 4th century CE, making it one of the longest-lasting philosophical schools in antiquity. The Pre-Socratics and the First Why. The pre-Socratic philosophers, working in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, began the systematic investigation of nature and reality that characterizes Western philosophy and science. They were the first in the Greek world to seek natural explanations for natural phenomena rather than relying exclusively on mythology. The term pre-Socratic is misleading. Many were contemporaries of Socrates. The term indicates focus, not chronology. Pre-Socratics concentrated on natural philosophy, understanding the physical world, while Socrates shifted attention to ethics and human life. Pre-Socratics left no complete works. Their writings survive only as fragments quoted by later authors or as secondhand reports. Aristotle and Theophrastus preserved much information in their own works. Later compilations provide additional material. The fragmentary evidence makes interpretation difficult and creates uncertainty about what these thinkers actually said. The central question was the nature of the arche, the fundamental principle or origin of all things. Traditional Greek religion explained natural phenomena through anthropomorphic gods. Zeus throws thunderbolts. Poseidon causes earthquakes. The sun is driven across the sky by Helios in his chariot. Pre-Socratics sought explanations that didn't depend on divine caprice. This shift from mythological to naturalistic explanation represents a fundamental change in human thought. It implies the world operates according to regular, understandable principles rather than arbitrary decisions of personal agents. This assumption makes systematic knowledge possible. If events occur because gods choose them, and gods can choose differently any time, prediction and understanding are impossible. If events occur because of regular natural processes, careful observation and reasoning can reveal those processes. What motivated this shift? Some scholars argue Greek religion was less dogmatic than other ancient religions, and therefore more compatible with philosophical questioning. Others point to social and economic changes, particularly trade and colonization, which exposed Greeks to different cultures and beliefs, encouraging critical examination of their own traditions. Still others emphasize the development of literacy, which allowed ideas to be recorded, examined, and criticized in ways oral tradition didn't permit. Pre-Socratics proposed various answers to the arche question. These reflect different ways of understanding what could serve as reality's fundamental principle. Some propose that a single physical substance underlies all apparent diversity. Others propose that reality consists of multiple distinct principles, some focused on what things are made of, others on processes that cause change. The tradition organized pre-Socratic thought into schools, though this may impose more structure than actually existed. Ancient sources distinguish the Ionians from Greek cities on Asia Minor's coast, the Eleatics from the colony of Elea in southern Italy, the Pythagoreans, the atomists, and the pluralists. These categories organize material, but shouldn't be taken to imply ancient philosophers thought of themselves as belonging to formal schools with clear boundaries. Pre-Socratics also addressed questions about knowledge. How can humans know anything about reality? Can senses be trusted? Is reason alone sufficient? These epistemological questions emerged naturally from cosmological inquiry. When different philosophers proposed contradictory accounts of reality, the question arose of how to determine which is correct. The relationship between appearance and reality became central. Things appear various ways to the senses. Water appears sometimes as liquid, sometimes ice, sometimes steam. The sun appears small, and to move around the earth. Are these appearances accurate, or does reality differ from appearance? Pre-Socratics divided on this. Some trusted senses and tried constructing accounts compatible with observation. Others argued that reason reveals truths contradicting sensory experience. Pre-Socratics also reflected on language and logic. If one says something comes to be, does this imply it previously was not? Can something come from nothing? If not, how is change possible? These questions may seem excessively abstract, but they concern fundamental issues about existence and causation. Puzzles from reflection on language and logic motivated much subsequent philosophy. The influence extended far beyond philosophy. Their attempt to explain natural phenomena through natural causes laid the foundation for science. Their methods of rational argument and systematic investigation became standard tools in many fields. Their questions about reality, knowledge, and change remain central to philosophy. Later philosophers responded variously. Plato incorporated some pre-Socratic ideas while rejecting others. His theory of forms can be seen as attempting to resolve pre-Socratic puzzles about change and permanence. Aristotle wrote extensively about predecessors and developed his philosophy, partly through criticizing theirs. Stoics and Epicureans drew on pre-Socratic physics. Even philosophers who rejected pre-Socratic conclusions continued engaging with their questions. Fragmentary survival creates interpretive challenges, but has advantages. Because we have only brief fragments and summaries, we can focus on arguments and ideas without being distracted by rhetoric or biographical details. Fragments often present philosophical positions in concentrated form. A single sentence from Heraclitus or Parmenides can contain a profound insight that later philosophers required pages to develop. Studying pre-Socratics requires careful attention to sources. Different ancient authors had different purposes. When quoting or describing earlier philosophers, Aristotle often described predecessors in ways making them seem to grope toward his own views. Christian authors sometimes portrayed pagan philosophers as anticipating Christian doctrines. Modern scholars must attempt reconstructing what pre-Socratics actually said from sources that were often unsympathetic or anachronistic. Despite difficulties, the importance is clear. They asked the first philosophical questions and proposed the first philosophical answers. They invented the practice of giving reasons for claims and subjecting those reasons to critical examination. They demonstrated that human reason can investigate reality's nature without relying on revelation or tradition. This achievement made all subsequent philosophy and science possible. Heraclitus, you can't step in the same river twice. Heraclitus of Ephesus lived around 535 to 475 BCE in Ephesus, a wealthy Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor. He came from an aristocratic family and reportedly turned down political offices, preferring philosophy to public life. Ancient sources describe him as arrogant, contemptuous of others, and deliberately obscure in his writing. They called him the Dark One, or the Obscure. Heraclitus wrote a single book and deposited it in the temple of Artemis in Ephesus. The book hasn't survived. We have about 140 fragments, most only a sentence or two, preserved as quotations in later authors. This makes comprehensive interpretation difficult, and scholars disagree substantially about what he meant. The most famous statement attributed to Heraclitus is that you can't step into the same river twice. Different sources report this in different forms. Heraclitus apparently said you can't step into the same river twice because different waters are always flowing. A later source adds that you can't step into the same river once. Another claims he said we both step and don't step into the same rivers. We are and are not. This saying expresses Heraclitus's view that reality is characterized by constant change or flux. Rivers provide a clear example. A river appears to be a stable object with definite location and identity. You can point to it, name it, describe it. Yet a river isn't actually a fixed collection of water molecules. The water is constantly flowing. The river at one moment consists of different water than the river the next moment. What makes it the same river isn't sameness of material, but continuity of structure and process. This observation generalizes. Everything undergoes constant change. A human body replaces its cells continuously. A person's thoughts and feelings change moment to moment. A city's population changes. Buildings are constructed and demolished, yet the city persists. Even apparently stable objects like rocks slowly change through weathering and erosion. Nothing remains absolutely unchanged. Heraclitus expressed this through various formulations. He said everything flows, though this exact phrase may be a later summary. He said the sun is new every day, meaning what we call the sun isn't the same object from one day to the next, but a continuous process of change. He compared the cosmos to an ever-living fire, kindled in measures and extinguished in measures. This emphasis on change distinguished Heraclitus from other pre-Socratics who sought a stable, unchanging principle underlying apparent change. Parmenides, slightly younger, would argue that change is impossible, and reality is actually static and unchanging. Heraclitus took the opposite position. Change isn't merely apparent, but constitutes reality's fundamental nature. However, Heraclitus didn't believe change is random or chaotic. Change follows a pattern or principle he called the logos. The term logos has many meanings in Greek: word, account, reason, proportion, principle. Heraclitus seems to have intended several meanings simultaneously. The logos is the rational principle according to which change occurs, the pattern or structure giving order to flux. Heraclitus criticized people for failing to understand the logos even though they encounter it constantly. The opening fragment apparently stated that although the logos exists always, people are unable to understand it, both before they hear it and when they first hear it. Everything occurs according to the logos, yet people act as if they have private understanding rather than recognizing the common logos governing all things. The concept connects to another key idea, the unity of opposites. Heraclitus observed that many things depend on their opposites and transform into their opposites. Health and disease are opposites, but disease makes health appreciated, and health can turn into disease. The road up and the road down are the same road, viewed from different perspectives. Seawater is pure and polluted simultaneously, pure for fish who need it, polluted for humans who can't drink it. These observations led him to conclude that opposites aren't completely distinct, but are aspects of a single underlying reality. Conflict between opposites drives change, but this conflict isn't destructive. He wrote that war is the father of all things, and that what is opposed brings together, and from what differs comes the most beautiful harmony. Tension between opposites, like the tension in a strung bow or tuned lyre, creates functional unity. Some ancient interpreters, particularly Plato, understood Heraclitus to mean everything is changing so rapidly that knowledge is impossible. If nothing remains stable even for an instant, you can't say anything true because it will have changed before the statement is complete. Plato rejected this extreme interpretation and used it to motivate his theory of forms, according to which knowledge requires eternal, unchanging objects existing in addition to the changing physical world. Modern scholars debate whether Plato's interpretation accurately represents Heraclitus. The fragments suggest Heraclitus believed in underlying stability within change, a logos or pattern that persists even as particular things change. The river changes its waters but maintains its identity as a river. Fire consumes fuel constantly but remains fire. Change follows regular patterns rather than occurring randomly. If this interpretation is correct, Heraclitus didn't make knowledge impossible, but redefined what knowledge must be. Knowledge is not of static objects, but of dynamic processes and patterns. Heraclitus had contempt for conventional learning and other philosophers. He wrote that much learning doesn't teach understanding, otherwise it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras. He criticized Homer for failing to understand that conflict is necessary. He said most people live as if they have private understanding rather than recognizing the common logos. He compared people to sleepwalkers who are unconscious of what they do while awake, just as they're unconscious while asleep. This contempt extended to religious practices. Heraclitus criticized people who purify themselves by polluting themselves with blood, comparing this to washing off mud with mud. He objected to prayers directed at statues, saying this is like talking to houses. These criticisms suggest Heraclitus distinguished between superficial religious observance and genuine understanding of the divine. Heraclitus identified the logos with God or the divine. One fragment states that the wise is one alone, unwilling and willing to be called by the name of Zeus. This suggests what people call Zeus represents the logos, the rational principle governing the cosmos, though calling it Zeus may mislead by suggesting a personal deity with human characteristics. The influence on later philosophy was substantial. Stoics adopted the concept of the logos as the rational principle governing the universe, though they developed it in directions Heraclitus might not recognize. Plato and Aristotle both engaged with Heraclitean ideas, usually critically. In the modern period, Hegel drew on Heraclitus when developing dialectical philosophy, in which contradictions drive historical development. Nietzsche praised Heraclitus for recognizing the centrality of conflict and becoming. The obscurity of Heraclitus's writing, whether deliberate or not, has enabled multiple interpretations. Some see him as a process philosopher who anticipated modern physics, describing reality in terms of fields and energies rather than static particles. Others see him as a mystic who achieved intuitive insight into reality's nature. Still others see him primarily as a social critic who used metaphysical claims to criticize conventional values. The fragments show a thinker who combined careful observation of natural phenomena with penetrating reflection on language and thought. His style is aphoristic and paradoxical, designed to provoke thought rather than convey information directly. Reading Heraclitus requires active engagement. The fragments don't present systematic theory, but offer insights readers must connect and develop. The Sophists, ancient Greece's first lawyers. The Sophists were a group of itinerant intellectuals in 5th century BCE Greece who traveled from city to city teaching rhetoric, philosophy, and various other subjects for pay. They became controversial figures, attacked by philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, but influential in developing education and legal thought. In many ways, they were ancient Greece's first professional educators and lawyers. The term sophist originally meant wise person or expert, without negative connotation. Over time, particularly after Plato's attacks, it came to mean someone who uses clever but deceptive arguments. This negative meaning persists in the modern word sophistry, but the historical sophists were more complex than Plato's caricatures suggest. What distinguished sophists from other philosophers was their willingness to teach for money. Traditional aristocratic education in Greece was informal, based on mentorship and social relationships. Philosophers like Socrates claimed not to charge fees, though Socrates had wealthy patrons. Sophists openly charged, sometimes substantial amounts, for their teaching. This made education accessible to those who could pay but weren't born into aristocratic circles. It also made sophists suspect to traditionalists who thought knowledge shouldn't be sold. The Sophists emerged during a period of rapid change in Greek society. Democratic reforms in Athens and other cities meant that ordinary citizens could participate in political and legal processes. Success in politics and law required skill in public speaking and argumentation. The Sophists offered to teach these skills. They promised to make the weaker argument the stronger, which could mean making a losing case win through rhetorical skill. Protagoras of Abdera was the most famous sophist. Born around 490 BCE, he traveled throughout the Greek world teaching rhetoric and philosophy. He's known for the statement, "Man is the measure of all things, of things that are that they are, and of things that are not that they are not." This is usually interpreted as a form of relativism. Truth isn't absolute, but relative to the individual or culture. What seems true to you is true for you. What seems true to me is true for me. This relativism had practical implications. If truth is relative, then there's no objective standard for judging competing claims. Success becomes a matter of persuasion rather than discovering objective truth. The better arguer wins, regardless of who's actually right. This made Pythagoras' teaching valuable for aspiring politicians and lawyers, but disturbing to philosophers seeking objective truth. Protagoras also addressed religion skeptically. He wrote, "Concerning the gods, I cannot know whether they exist or not, nor what form they might have. Many things prevent knowledge, including the obscurity of the subject and the shortness of human life." This agnosticism got him in trouble. According to some sources, he was charged with impiety, his books were burned, and he fled Athens, drowning on the voyage. Gorgias of Leontini was another prominent sophist, known for his rhetorical brilliance. He argued, apparently seriously though some think it was satire, that nothing exists, that if anything did exist it couldn't be known, and that if it could be known, it couldn't be communicated. This extreme skepticism or nihilism challenged fundamental assumptions about reality and knowledge. If Gorgias is right, philosophy is pointless because there's nothing to know and no way to communicate it. Despite or because of these arguments, Gorgias was immensely successful as a teacher of rhetoric. He charged enormous fees and became wealthy. His influence on rhetorical style was substantial. He developed elaborate techniques involving balanced clauses, rhythmic patterns, and poetic language that made speeches memorable and persuasive. Hippias of Elis claimed to teach everything. He traveled to cities offering instruction in mathematics, astronomy, grammar, history, poetry, and rhetoric. He also practiced various crafts and claimed to have made everything he wore and carried with him. Ancient sources portray him as arrogant and boastful, though whether this characterization is fair is unclear. He represents the sophist as universal expert, willing to teach any subject for the right price. Paradoxes of Zeno specialized in precise distinctions between similar words. He taught that understanding the exact meaning of words is essential for clear thinking and effective communication. Some of his work anticipated modern linguistic philosophy. However, ancient sources also mock him for making excessive distinctions that seem pedantic rather than helpful. Thrasymachus of Chalcedon appears in Plato's Republic arguing that justice is whatever benefits the stronger party. Rulers make laws to benefit themselves and call this justice. Therefore, justice is really just the advantage of those in power. This cynical view challenges conventional morality and suggests that ethical standards are masks for self-interest. Plato's treatment of the sophists in his dialogues is mostly hostile. He portrays them as mercenary, more concerned with winning arguments than discovering truth, willing to teach techniques of persuasion without regard for moral content. The contrast Plato draws between Socrates, who seeks truth through questioning and never charges fees, and the sophists who teach rhetorical tricks for money, shape subsequent views of the sophists negatively. However, Plato's portrayal is biased. He had philosophical and political reasons to attack the sophists. Their relativism threatened his theory of absolute forms. Their success as paid teachers competed with his academy. Their democratic politics opposed his preference for rule by philosopher kings. Modern scholars recognize that Plato's attacks shouldn't be taken at face value. The sophists made genuine contributions. They developed rhetorical theory systematically. They raised important questions about the nature of truth, knowledge, and morality. They democratized education by making it available to those who could pay, rather than only those born into the right families. They recognized that language and argument are tools that can be studied and improved. The distinction between philosophy and sophistry that Plato tried to establish is less clear than he suggested. Both involve argument and persuasion. Both make claims about truth and reality. The difference Plato emphasized was that philosophy seeks objective truth, while sophistry seeks only persuasive success. But whether objective truth exists, and whether philosophy actually discovers it, are precisely the questions the sophists raised. Their relativism and skepticism remain live philosophical positions today. The legal profession developed partly from sophistic teaching. The ability to argue both sides of a case, to make the weaker argument stronger, to use language precisely, to understand how to persuade an audience. These skills that sophists taught are still central to legal practice. Modern lawyers, like ancient sophists, are sometimes criticized for being more concerned with winning than with truth or justice. The analogy isn't perfect, but it's not accidental. The sophists' writings have mostly been lost. We know them primarily through hostile sources, particularly Plato, which makes fair evaluation difficult. It's as if we knew Martin Luther only through Catholic polemics, or knew Democrats only through Republican attack ads. Despite this, enough survives to show that the sophists were serious thinkers who raised important questions that remain relevant. Aristotle's lost works. Aristotle wrote two kinds of works. The dialogues he published during his lifetime were literary works intended for general audiences, written in polished prose and widely read in antiquity. Then there were his lecture notes and research materials, technical works used within his school, written in dense, compressed style. The dialogues have been almost entirely lost. What we have are the lecture notes. This creates a strange situation. Aristotle was praised in antiquity for the elegance of his writing. Cicero called his prose a river of gold. But when modern readers pick up Aristotle, they find dense, difficult, often repetitive text that's hard to follow. That's because we're reading what amounts to lecture notes rather than works intended for publication. The dialogues Aristotle wrote included works on philosophy, ethics, politics, and other subjects. Ancient sources mention titles like On Philosophy, On Justice, On Poets, Protrepticus, An Exhortation to Philosophy, and others. These were apparently written in dialogue form, like Plato's dialogues, with characters discussing philosophical questions. Fragments survive as quotations in later authors, but we don't have complete texts of any dialogue. Why were the dialogues lost while the lecture notes survived? The story involves accidents of history, library fires, and manuscripts hidden in cellars. According to the ancient biographer Strabo, after Aristotle's death, his library passed to his successor Theophrastus. When Theophrastus died, the library went to Neleus, a student who took the books to his home in Asia Minor. Neleus's heirs, who weren't scholars, hid the books in a cellar to prevent them from being seized by the kings of Pergamum, who were collecting books for their library. The books remained hidden for about 2 centuries, suffering damage from moisture and insects. Eventually they were sold to a pelican of Teos, a book collector in Athens. A pelican tried to restore the damaged texts, but according to Strabo, he wasn't a good scholar and made many errors. When Rome conquered Athens in 86 BCE, the Roman general Sulla seized a pelican's library and brought it to Rome. There, scholars like Andronicus of Rhodes edited the texts, producing the versions that survived. This story may be partly legendary, but it explains why we have Aristotle's lecture notes rather than his published works. The lecture notes, kept within the school for teaching purposes, survived through the specific chain of events Strabo describes. The published dialogues, which circulated more widely, were lost in the various library fires and disasters that destroyed so much ancient literature. What did we lose? The dialogue. On Philosophy apparently contained Aristotle's mature views on metaphysics and theology, possibly presenting them more systematically and accessibly than the surviving metaphysics. The dialogue on justice treated ethical and political questions. The Protrepticus was an exhortation to philosophical life, apparently influential on later philosophers. On Poets contained Aristotle's analysis of poetry, complementing the surviving Poetics, but treating comedy and other genres that the Poetics doesn't cover. We have some idea what these lost works contained through fragments quoted by later authors. For instance, Cicero quotes extensively from On Philosophy in his own philosophical works. These fragments show Aristotle engaging with Platonic philosophy, developing his own positions, and writing an elegant, persuasive prose quite different from the surviving treatises. The loss of Aristotle's dialogues may have significantly affected how later generations understood his philosophy. The dialogues were probably more accessible and engaging than the lecture notes. They may have presented Aristotle's views in ways that showed their connections to broader questions about human life, rather than focusing narrowly on technical problems. The Aristotle we know from the surviving works is a systematic, scientific thinker who carefully analyzes and categorizes. The Aristotle of the lost dialogues may have been more literary and more explicitly concerned with how philosophy relates to living well. Besides the dialogues, other Aristotelian works have been lost. A collection of 158 constitutions of Greek city-states compiled by Aristotle and his students is mentioned in ancient sources. Only one, the Constitution of Athens, survives, discovered on papyrus in Egypt in 1879. The lost constitutions would be invaluable for understanding Greek political history and Aristotle's political thought. Aristotle also wrote works on specific scientific subjects that haven't survived. Ancient catalogs list works on plants, on minerals, on anatomy, and other topics. Some may have been incorporated into surviving works. Others are genuinely lost. Given Aristotle's careful observational method and his contributions to biology, these lost scientific works might contain important information about ancient scientific knowledge. The situation with Aristotle's lost works reflects a broader pattern. Most ancient literature has been lost. We have perhaps 10% or less of what was written. Works survived through chains of copying by hand. Each copy introduced potential errors. Libraries burned, manuscripts deteriorated, and most importantly, later generations chose which works to copy and which to let disappear. Works that seemed less important, less useful, less interesting to medieval scribes simply weren't copied and were lost. The works that survived often did so by chance. A single manuscript of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things survived the Middle Ages. If that one manuscript had been lost, we wouldn't know Epicurean physics in anything like the detail we do. Many works survived only because they were used in schools. Works too difficult or too specialized for teaching purposes were more likely to be lost. Modern technology offers some hope for recovering lost ancient texts. The discovery of carbonized papyrus scrolls at Herculaneum, buried by Vesuvius in 79 CE, has yielded some previously unknown works, particularly by the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus. New imaging techniques allow reading some of these carbonized scrolls without unrolling them, which would destroy them. More texts may be recovered as technology improves, but Aristotle's dialogues, lost for over 1,000 years, are unlikely to be recovered. They were copied widely in antiquity, which means they disappeared through lack of interest rather than through a single accident. Later generations preferred Aristotle's technical works to his literary dialogues. That preference shaped how Aristotle was read and understood for centuries, and determined which of his works survived. The Academy and the Lyceum. In the 4th century BCE, Athens had two great philosophical schools that would shape Western thought for centuries. Plato founded the Academy around 387 BCE, and Aristotle founded the Lyceum in 335 BCE. These weren't universities in the modern sense, but they were something new in the Greek world, permanent institutions dedicated to philosophical research and teaching. Plato established the Academy in a grove of trees sacred to the hero Academus, located about a mile outside Athens' city walls. The location gave the school its name. Plato bought property there and created a space where philosophers could live, study, and teach together. The Academy wasn't just a place to attend lectures, it was a community where members shared meals, engaged in conversation, and pursued philosophical inquiry as a way of life. The Academy focused on mathematics and dialectic. According to tradition, an inscription over the entrance read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." Whether this inscription actually existed is uncertain, but it reflects the Academy's emphasis on mathematical training as preparation for philosophy. Students studied arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and harmonics before moving to dialectic, the art of philosophical conversation through question and answer. The curriculum reflected Plato's philosophy. Mathematics trains the mind to think about abstract, eternal objects rather than physical, changeable things. The forms, which Plato believed were the ultimate reality, are like mathematical objects, eternal, unchanging, knowable only through reason. By studying mathematics, students prepared their minds to understand the forms. Dialectic then led students from hypotheses about particular forms to knowledge of the form of the good itself. The Academy wasn't a one-man show. Plato attracted talented students who became philosophers in their own right. Eudoxus of Cnidus, a brilliant mathematician and astronomer, worked at the Academy and made important contributions to both fields. Speusippus, Plato's nephew, succeeded him as head of the Academy. Socrates led the Academy later and systematized Platonic philosophy. And of course, Aristotle studied at the Academy for 20 years. After Plato died in 347 BCE, the Academy continued under new leadership, but it gradually moved away from Plato's original doctrines. Speusippus rejected Plato's theory of forms. Later heads of the Academy adopted skeptical positions, arguing that certain knowledge is impossible and that the wise person suspends judgment. By the time Cicero visited Athens in the 1st century BCE, the Academy taught skepticism rather than Platonism. This skeptical academy continued until 86 BCE, when Sulla's army destroyed it during Rome's conquest of Athens. A later new academy, or Neoplatonic Academy, was founded in the 5th century CE by Plutarch of Athens. This school returned to studying Plato, but interpreted him through the lens of Neoplatonism, a later philosophical movement that combined Platonic philosophy with other influences. This academy continued until 529 CE, when the Byzantine Emperor Justinian closed it as part of his suppression of pagan philosophy. If we count from Plato's founding to Justinian's closure, the Academy existed for over 900 years. Aristotle founded the Lyceum after returning to Athens in 335 BCE. He left Athens after Plato died, spent time in Asia Minor and Macedon tutoring Alexander, and came back as a mature philosopher with his own system. Like the Academy, the Lyceum was located in a grove outside Athens, this one sacred to Apollo Lyceus, which gave the school its name. The word Lyceum still means secondary school in some languages, a distant echo of Aristotle's institution. The Lyceum had a different character from the Academy. Aristotle emphasized empirical research alongside philosophical argument. He and his students collected information about plants, animals, political systems, historical events, and various other subjects. They built what may have been the first research library, collecting books and documents for scholarly study. The Lyceum was sometimes called the Peripatetic school because Aristotle had a habit of walking around while teaching. Peripatetic means walking about. Whether he actually taught while walking or just walked in the covered walkways of the Lyceum between sessions is unclear, but the name stuck. Members of the school were called Peripatetics. Aristotle organized systematic research projects involving multiple people. The study of 158 Greek constitutions mentioned earlier was a collective project. Students gathered information about different city-states' political systems, which Aristotle then analyzed in his Politics. This approach to research, involving coordinated effort and systematic data collection, was innovative. The curriculum at the Lyceum covered everything Aristotle thought worth studying. Logic, as a tool for organizing knowledge. Natural philosophy, covering physics, biology, psychology, and astronomy. Metaphysics, studying being itself and first principles. Ethics and politics, examining how humans should live individually and collectively. Rhetoric and poetics, analyzing persuasive speech and literature. Aristotle believed all these subjects were interconnected and that philosophers should master them all. Teaching methods differed from the academy. Aristotle gave two kinds of lectures. Acroamatic or esoteric lectures in the morning were technical discussions for advanced students, covering difficult material in the compressed style we find in the surviving treatises. Exoteric lectures in the afternoon were for general audiences, probably more polished and accessible. The dialogues Aristotle published were apparently based on these afternoon lectures. After Aristotle left Athens in 323 BCE, fleeing charges of impiety after Alexander's death, Theophrastus became head of the Lyceum. Theophrastus was a brilliant scholar who continued Aristotle's research program, particularly in botany. His works on plants are the most important botanical texts surviving from antiquity. He led the Lyceum for 36 years, maintaining it as a major intellectual center. Later heads of the Lyceum included Strato of Lampsacus, who emphasized physics and experimental method, and Lyco of Troas. The school continued until at least the 1st century BCE. Though by then it was less prominent than it had been under Aristotle, and Theophrastus Cicero studied there during his time in Athens. Eventually the Lyceum faded away, though precisely when is unclear. The relationship between the academy and Lyceum was complex. They were rivals, competing for students and patrons. Philosophical disagreements between Plato and Aristotle meant the schools taught different doctrines. The academy emphasized mathematics and dialectic, aiming at knowledge of eternal forms. The Lyceum emphasized empirical research and systematic analysis, seeking to understand the natural world through observation. Yet the schools also shared much. Both assumed that philosophy is the highest activity humans can pursue. Both believed reason can discover truth about reality. Both saw philosophy as a way of life requiring discipline and dedication. Both attracted talented students who made important contributions to various fields. Both preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations. These schools established a model for later institutions. When universities developed in medieval Europe, they drew on this model of communities dedicated to learning, with teachers and students working together to advance knowledge. The idea that advanced education should involve research as well as teaching, that institutions should preserve libraries and support scholars. That knowledge in different fields is interconnected. These ideas trace back partly to the academy and Lyceum. The schools also showed that philosophy could be institutionalized without being ossified. Both evolved over time, adapting to new ideas while maintaining intellectual standards. The academy moved from Platonism to skepticism and back to Neoplatonism. The Lyceum maintained Aristotelian interests while developing them in new directions. This flexibility allowed them to survive for centuries despite political turmoil, economic challenges, and changing intellectual fashions. When we read Plato and Aristotle today, we're reading texts that came from these institutions. The dialogues Plato wrote were shaped by the conversations at the academy. The treatises Aristotle wrote were lecture notes from the Lyceum. Understanding these schools helps us understand the texts. Philosophy for these thinkers wasn't a solitary activity. It was collaborative, social, embedded in institutional structures that supported sustained inquiry. Stoicism before the Romans. When most people think of Stoicism today, they think of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who wrote Meditations, or Seneca, the Roman statesman and dramatist, but Stoicism began in Athens 3 centuries earlier, founded by a Phoenician merchant who turned to philosophy after a shipwreck destroyed his cargo. Zeno of Citium was born around 334 BCE in Citium, a Phoenician colony on Cyprus. He worked in the family business, trading Tyrian purple dye, a luxury product made from murex snails. Around 312 BCE, his ship sank near Athens, destroying his merchandise. Stranded in Athens and financially ruined, Zeno wandered into a bookshop and heard someone reading Xenophon's Memorabilia, which recounted conversations with Socrates. Fascinated, Zeno asked where he could find such men. The bookseller pointed to Crates the cynic, who happened to be walking by. Zeno studied with Crates and other philosophers in Athens for about 20 years before founding his own school around 300 BCE. He couldn't afford to rent space, so he taught in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, a covered colonnade in the Athenian marketplace decorated with murals depicting Greek military victories. The location gave his philosophy its name. Students and followers were called Stoics because they met at the Stoa. Stoic philosophy had three main parts: logic, physics, and ethics. The Stoics compared philosophy to an orchard. Logic is the protective wall around it. Physics is the trees. Ethics is the fruit. All three parts were necessary, but ethics was what mattered most. The goal was to teach people how to live well. Stoic logic was sophisticated. Zeno and his successors developed propositional logic, analyzing arguments in terms of relationships between entire propositions rather than just terms. They identified valid argument forms and studied fallacies. This work paralleled and in some ways anticipated developments in medieval and modern logic. Stoic physics was materialist. Everything that exists is material, including the soul and even God. The Stoics identified God with logos, the rational principle organizing the cosmos. They believe the universe is a living, rational organism. Everything happens according to fate, which means according to the causal chain determined by the logos. There's no randomness, no chance. Everything that happens is necessary given what came before. This determinism raised an obvious problem. If everything is fated, how can humans have free will? How can we be responsible for our actions? The Stoics had a complex answer involving different senses of necessity and possibility, but their position remained controversial. Critics argued that Stoic determinism made ethics impossible. If I'm fated to do what I do, how can I be blamed for it? Stoic ethics centered on the concept of living according to nature. Nature here means both human nature and the nature of the cosmos. Human nature is rational. The cosmos is organized by rational principle. Therefore, living according to nature means living rationally, following reason rather than emotion. The Stoics distinguished between things in our control and things not in our control. Our own judgments, desires, and actions are in our control. Everything else, including our bodies, property, reputation, and other people's actions, is not fully in our control. The key to happiness is to care only about what's in our control and to be indifferent to everything else. This led to the Stoic doctrine of preferred and dispreferred indifference. Most things that people value, like health, wealth, and reputation, are actually indifferent in the technical sense that they don't affect whether you're virtuous, and virtue is the only true good. However, some indifferents are reasonably preferred. Health is better than sickness, wealth better than poverty, reputation better than disgrace. Even though none of these affect your virtue, the wise person prefers them but doesn't depend on them for happiness. The Stoics also developed the concept of oikeiosis, often translated as appropriation or familiarization. Humans naturally care for themselves. This concern then extends outward in circles, to family, to friends, to fellow citizens, eventually to all of humanity. Moral development involves recognizing that all humans share the same rational nature and therefore deserve equal concern. This cosmopolitanism was radical in a world divided by city-states, ethnicities, and classes. After Zeno died around 262 BCE, Cleanthes succeeded him as head of the school. Cleanthes is known primarily for his Hymn to Zeus, a surviving poem that presents Stoic theology in religious language. He was succeeded by Chrysippus, who became the most important early Stoic after Zeno. Chrysippus was prolific, writing over 700 works according to ancient sources. None survive complete, though fragments remain. He systematized Stoic philosophy, defending it against critics and developing its logic and physics in detail. Ancient sources said that if there were logic among the gods, it would be the logic of Chrysippus. His work established Stoic doctrine for later generations. Early Stoicism spread throughout the Greek world. Philosophers associated with the school taught in Athens, Rhodes, and elsewhere. The philosophy appealed particularly to educated elites who appreciated its intellectual rigor and its promise of tranquility through rational self-control. The Stoics emphasized that philosophy should be practical. Theoretical knowledge matters only if it helps you live better. This meant Stoics concerned themselves with concrete ethical questions. How should you handle insults? How should you respond to loss? How should you face death? The answers always came back to the same principles. Focus on what's in your control, act rationally, accept fate. One distinctive Stoic practice was the morning and evening meditation. In the morning, remind yourself of Stoic principles and prepare for the day's challenges. In the evening, review the day and examine whether you acted according to reason. This practice of self-examination became central to Stoic life. The Stoics also practiced negative visualization. Imagine losing what you value, your health, your property, your loved ones. This wasn't pessimism, but preparation. By contemplating loss in advance, you reduce the shock if it occurs and increase appreciation for what you have now. You also remind yourself that these things aren't in your complete control and shouldn't be the basis of your happiness. Another practice was the view from above. Imagine yourself looking down at Earth from high in the sky, or even from among the stars. From this perspective, human concerns shrink to insignificance. The things that seem desperately important in daily life appear trivial when viewed from cosmic perspective. This practice cultivates detachment and helps maintain focus on what truly matters. When Stoicism moved to Rome in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, it evolved. Roman Stoics like Palladius and Posidonius adapted Greek Stoicism to Roman culture and concerns. They softened some harsh doctrines and emphasized practical ethics over theoretical physics and logic. This Roman Stoicism is what most people know through Seneca, Epicurus, and Marcus Aurelius. But the foundation was Greek. Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus created a philosophical system that promised happiness through virtue, peace through acceptance of fate, and freedom through recognition of what's in your control. Their work shaped not only ancient philosophy, but also influenced early Christianity, Renaissance humanism, and modern cognitive behavioral therapy. The merchant who lost his cargo in a shipwreck ended up creating one of the most influential philosophies in Western history. Cynicism as a lifestyle. Cynicism began not as a philosophy of abstract principles, but as a radical way of life. Before Diogenes made it famous by living in a storage jar, Antisthenes, a student of Socrates, laid its foundations. Cynicism asked a simple question: what do you actually need to be happy? The answer turned out to be almost nothing. Antisthenes was born around 445 BCE, probably to an Athenian father and a Thracian mother. This mixed parentage meant he wasn't a full Athenian citizen, which may have influenced his later rejection of social conventions. He studied with various teachers before becoming a devoted follower of Socrates. After Socrates' execution, Antisthenes developed his own philosophical approach. He taught at the Cynosarges Gymnasium, a training ground for those who, like him, weren't full citizens. The name Cynosarges meant something like white dog or quick dog, which may have contributed to his followers being called cynics, dog-like philosophers. Whether the name came from the gymnasium, from their lifestyle, or from insults hurled at them is unclear. What's clear is that they embraced it. Antisthenes' philosophy started from Socratic principles. Virtue is knowledge. Virtue is the only good. The virtuous person is self-sufficient and happy, regardless of external circumstances, but Antisthenes took these ideas further than Socrates did. If virtue is sufficient for happiness, then everything else is not just less important, but actively unnecessary. Wealth, reputation, pleasure, comfort, all the things people normally pursue are at best indifferent and at worst obstacles to virtue. This led to a radical program of reducing needs. Antisthenes lived simply, wore rough clothing, and owned little. He taught that happiness comes from self-sufficiency, and self-sufficiency comes from needing as little as possible. The person who needs nothing cannot be threatened, manipulated, or disappointed. That's true freedom. Antisthenes also challenged conventional values directly. He questioned whether social distinctions like citizenship, class, and ethnicity mattered. He argued that virtue is the same everywhere, and that conventional honor and shame are arbitrary. Some sources claim he said the wise person should have children with the best women, regardless of social status, which was a shocking rejection of Greek marriage customs. His attitude toward philosophy was pragmatic. He reportedly said he'd rather go mad than feel pleasure, expressing contempt for hedonism. He emphasized action over theory. Virtue is shown through deeds, not words. Long philosophical arguments about abstract questions are useless if they don't lead to better living. When Diogenes encountered Antisthenes and asked to become his student, Antisthenes initially refused. Diogenes persisted, and eventually Antisthenes accepted him. Diogenes took Antisthenes' ideas and embodied them even more extremely. If Antisthenes lived simply, Diogenes lived in a jar. If Antisthenes rejected convention, Diogenes violated every social norm he could. This pattern of radicalizing the teacher's ideas became characteristic of cynicism. Each generation took the principles further. The goal wasn't to develop sophisticated theories, but to live according to nature completely, stripping away all social artifice. Crates of Thebes, who lived slightly after Diogenes, exemplified this further development. Crates came from a wealthy family, but gave away his entire fortune to live as a cynic. He married Hipparchia, a woman who also adopted cynic life. Hipparchia's choice was remarkable. Women in ancient Greece had little freedom to choose their own paths. Hipparchia rejected a conventional marriage to live as a philosopher, wearing rough clothing and living simply alongside crates. They apparently consummated their marriage in public, shocking Athenian society, but demonstrating cynic principles about the naturalness of bodily functions. Crates was known for gentleness despite his radical lifestyle. Unlike Diogenes, who was confrontational and insulting, Crates taught through example and kindness. People called him the door opener because he would walk into houses uninvited, but instead of being thrown out, he was welcomed because his advice was helpful. This showed that cynicism could be lived without constant antagonism. The Cynics developed specific practices for training themselves in virtue. They practiced hardship deliberately, walking barefoot in snow, sleeping on the ground, eating the simplest food. All of this toughened them against dependence on comfort. They called this ascesis, training, from which we get the word asceticism. The idea was that by voluntarily enduring hardship, you become indifferent to it. Then when hardship comes involuntarily, it doesn't affect you. They also practiced shamelessness. Not because they had no shame naturally, but because they recognized shame as socially constructed. Things considered shameful in one culture are normal in another. Shame controls behavior by making people fear social disapproval. The cynic frees himself from this control by deliberately doing shameless things and discovering that nothing terrible happens. This is why Diogenes performed bodily functions in public. He was training himself out of socially imposed shame. Cynic philosophy had minimal theoretical component. They weren't interested in metaphysics or epistemology or logic. Some cynics, particularly later ones, developed ethical theories, but early cynics focused on practice. Philosophy is a way of life, not a body of doctrines. You become a cynic by living like a cynic, not by believing certain propositions. This practical focus made cynicism accessible. You didn't need extensive education to understand it. The core message, that happiness comes from needing little and living according to nature, is simple. Implementation is hard, but understanding is easy. This contrasts with Platonism or Aristotelianism, which require years of study to grasp. Cynicism influenced later philosophies significantly. Stoicism, as mentioned, developed from cynic roots. Zeno studied with Crates before founding his own school, Stoic ethics, particularly the emphasis on self-sufficiency and distinguishing what's in your control from what isn't, came directly from cynicism. The Stoics added theoretical structure and made the lifestyle less extreme, but the core insights were cynic. Early Christianity also shows cynic influence. The itinerant lifestyle of Jesus and his disciples, their rejection of wealth and property, their criticism of conventional religious authorities, their message that the kingdom of God is accessible to everyone regardless of social status, all of this resembles cynic teaching and practice. Some scholars argue that Jesus was influenced by cynicism, though this remains controversial. Cynicism as a movement continued for centuries. Cynic preachers, recognizable by their rough cloaks and begging bags, were common figures in the ancient Mediterranean world well into the Roman Empire. Some were genuine philosophers, others were charlatans using cynic trappings to justify begging. This tension between authentic and fake cynics was recognized in antiquity and led to criticism of the movement. The cynics left almost no writings. Diogenes and Crates supposedly wrote works, but they're lost. We know cynicism primarily through anecdotes and through critical accounts by other philosophers. This is fitting. Cynicism was never primarily about texts or arguments. It was about living a certain way. The proof of cynic philosophy wasn't in treatises, but in the lives of those who practiced it. Democritus and Atomic Theory. Democritus of Abdera, born around 460 BCE, proposed that everything in the universe is made of tiny, indivisible particles moving through empty space. He called these particles atoms, from the Greek atomos meaning uncuttable. This theory, developed with his teacher Leucippus, was remarkably close to modern atomic theory, even though Democritus had no experimental evidence and was working purely from philosophical reasoning. The atomists were trying to solve a problem that had troubled earlier Greek philosophers. Parmenides had argued that change is impossible because something cannot come from nothing, and if something exists, it cannot cease to exist. This seemed to make the obvious reality of change logically impossible. Other philosophers proposed various solutions, but none were entirely satisfactory. Leucippus and Democritus proposed a radical answer. Reality consists of two things, atoms and void. Atoms are tiny, solid, indivisible particles that have always existed and will always exist. They cannot be created or destroyed. The void is empty space, absolute nothingness. Atoms move through the void, colliding and combining in various arrangements. What we perceive as change is actually rearrangement of atoms. When wood burns, the atoms that made up the wood separate and recombine in new forms as smoke and ash. Nothing is truly created or destroyed. The atoms remain, but their arrangement changes. This preserved Parmenides' insight that being cannot come from non-being while explaining how change is possible. Atoms, according to Democritus, differ from each other only in shape, size, and arrangement. Some atoms are smooth, others rough. Some are hooked, allowing them to link together. Some are large, others tiny. These physical differences explain the properties of different substances. Fire consists of small, smooth atoms that move quickly and can penetrate other materials. Earth consists of larger, rougher atoms that lock together firmly. Everything has a natural explanation in terms of atoms and void. The soul is made of particularly fine, smooth atoms distributed throughout the body. Death occurs when these soul atoms disperse. There is no immortal soul, no afterlife. Gods might exist as configurations of atoms, but they don't intervene in human affairs. The universe operates according to mechanical necessity. Atoms move and collide according to physical laws, not divine will. Democritus explained perception mechanistically. Objects constantly shed thin films of atoms, like peeling layers of an onion. These films travel through the air and enter our sense organs. Vision occurs when these films enter the eye. Different films produce different perceptions. This explanation is wrong in details, but right in principle that perception involves physical interaction between external objects and sense organs. He distinguished between what he called legitimate and bastard knowledge. Perception gives bastard knowledge because senses can be fooled, and because they show us how things appear, not how they truly are. Honey tastes sweet, but sweetness isn't an objective property of honey. It's how honey atoms interact with tongue atoms. Legitimate knowledge comes from reason, which can understand the true nature of things, atoms and void. This distinction raised skeptical problems that atomists struggled with. If senses deceive us and show only appearances, how can we trust them to tell us anything about atoms? We can't see atoms. We infer their existence from reasoning about sensory experience, but if sensory experience is unreliable, the inference is questionable. Later atomists, particularly Epicurus, had to address this problem. Democritus wrote extensively on physics, mathematics, music, poetry, ethics, and other subjects. Ancient sources credit him with over 70 works. Nearly all are lost. We have fragments, mostly ethical sayings, preserved because later authors quoted them, but we don't have his detailed arguments or systematic exposition of atomic theory. The ethical fragments show Democritus believed happiness comes from mental tranquility rather than bodily pleasure or external goods. He used the term euthymia, good-spiritedness or cheerfulness. The wise person cultivates this through moderation, avoiding excess in either direction. Too much pleasure leads to pain. Too much striving for external goods leads to anxiety. Peace of mind comes from accepting what you have and not desiring what you lack. This ethics seems disconnected from his atomistic physics. If everything is atoms operating mechanistically, where does value come from? How can anything matter? Democritus apparently didn't work out the connection systematically. He had a naturalistic physics and a conventional moderate ethics. Later atomists, particularly Epicurus, developed ethics more explicitly from atomistic premises. Democritus's atomic theory faced criticism from other philosophers. Aristotle objected that atoms moving in void would all fall at the same speed, which means they would never catch up to collide. If they never collide, they can't combine to form complex objects. Aristotle also rejected the concept of void. Empty space seemed impossible to him. Space is where things are located. Truly empty space would be nowhere, which is not a location. Plato apparently disliked atomism so much that he never mentioned Democritus by name, though he probably had Democritus in mind when criticizing materialist philosophies. The Platonist tradition preferred the view that mind or soul is fundamental and matter is derivative. Atomism reversed this, making matter fundamental and treating mind as an emergent property of atomic arrangements. Despite these criticisms, atomism persisted. Epicurus adopted atomic theory in the late 4th century BCE and made it the basis of his philosophy. He modified Democritus's version, introducing the concept of the atomic swerve, a tiny random deviation in atomic motion that Epicurus thought was necessary to explain free will. Lucretius later presented Epicurean atomism in his poem On the Nature of Things, which preserved the theory for later generations. After the rise of Christianity, atomism became suspect because it seemed atheistic. If everything is explained by atoms and void, there's no role for God. The mechanical necessity of atomic motion seemed to eliminate free will and moral responsibility. Christian philosophers generally rejected atomism in favor of philosophies that preserved a place for God and the immortal soul. Atomism was revived in the 17th century by scientists and philosophers including Gassendi, Boyle, and Newton. They combined ancient atomism with new experimental methods, developing what became modern chemistry and physics, but they modified it significantly. They introduced forces acting between atoms, which ancient atomists hadn't conceived. They eventually discovered that atoms are divisible, contradicting the core atomist claim. Modern atomic theory differs from ancient atomism in crucial ways. Ancient atoms were uncuttable and had no internal structure. Modern atoms consist of protons, neutrons, and electrons, which themselves consist of quarks and other particles. Ancient atomists explained everything through atomic shape, size, and arrangement. Modern physics introduces forces, fields, and quantum effects that ancient atomists never imagined. Yet Democritus got something fundamentally right. Reality does consist of tiny particles whose arrangements explain the properties of matter. Chemical change does involve rearrangement rather than creation or destruction of fundamental constituents. The universe does operate according to natural laws rather than divine intervention. These insights, achieved through pure reasoning without any experimental evidence, represent one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements in ancient philosophy. The tragedy is how little of Democritus's work survives. He was called the laughing philosopher because he supposedly found human folly amusing. He lived to a great age, reportedly over 100. He wrote systematically on nearly every subject, and almost all of it is gone. We know him through fragments and through hostile accounts by philosophers who disagreed with him. It's as if we knew Einstein only through summaries by people who thought relativity was wrong. What we've lost may be as important as what survived. The Mystery Religions and Orphism. Alongside the public religious festivals that every Greek citizen participated in, ancient Greece had mystery religions. These were secret cults that promised initiates special knowledge and a better afterlife. You couldn't just wander in. You had to be initiated through rituals that were kept strictly secret. Revealing the mysteries to outsiders was a serious crime, sometimes punishable by death. The most famous were the Eleusinian Mysteries, centered at Eleusis, near Athens. These mysteries honored Demeter and Persephone, and involved a secret nighttime ceremony that initiates never described in detail. We know thousands of people were initiated over many centuries, including prominent philosophers and politicians, but the core ritual remained secret. What we know comes from hints, from artistic representations, from things said around the edges of the secret. The mysteries apparently involved a dramatic reenactment of Persephone's abduction by Hades and her eventual return, symbolizing death and rebirth. Initiates underwent purification, fasted, drank a special barley drink called kykeon, and experienced something in the inner sanctuary that profoundly affected them. Ancient sources speak of initiates seeing a great light, experiencing visions, and feeling certainty about what happens after death. Cicero wrote that the mysteries gave people not just hope for a better afterlife, but made them happy to die. Orphism was another mystery tradition, but looser and less centralized than the Eleusinian mysteries. Orphic initiates followed teachings attributed to the mythical poet Orpheus. These teachings emphasize that humans have a dual nature. The body is material and mortal, descended from the Titans who were earthborn and violent, but the soul is divine, containing a spark of Dionysus, who the Titans had torn apart and eaten before Zeus destroyed them with lightning. This created an Orphic doctrine of original sin. Unusual in Greek thought, humans carry guilt from the Titans' crime. The soul is imprisoned in the body as punishment. Death releases the soul, but it then faces judgment and may be reincarnated in another body, human or animal. This cycle of reincarnation continues until the soul is finally purified and can rejoin the gods. Orphic followers practiced special rites to purify the soul. They followed strict dietary rules, particularly avoiding meat, because killing and eating animals was wrong. Given that animals might contain reincarnated human souls, they underwent initiations involving sacred texts, password, and ritual acts meant to prepare the soul for the afterlife. Gold tablets buried with Orphic initiates contained instructions for the soul's journey after death, including what to say to the guardians of the underworld. These tablets, discovered in graves across the Greek world, provide our best evidence for Orphic beliefs. They instruct the soul to avoid one spring in the underworld and drink instead from the spring of memory. They give passwords to tell the guardians, "I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone." The soul must prove it belongs among the gods rather than among ordinary dead. Orphism influenced philosophy significantly. Pythagoras adopted the doctrine of reincarnation, possibly from Orphic sources. The Pythagorean vegetarianism and emphasis on purification resemble Orphic practices. Plato's theory of the soul as immortal and imprisoned in the body, which must be purified through philosophy, shows Orphic influence. The idea that the philosopher escapes the cycle of reincarnation by achieving wisdom parallels Orphic soteriology. The relationship between philosophy and mystery religions was complex. Philosophers criticized mysteries for promising salvation through ritual rather than through understanding. Heraclitus reportedly said that the mysteries, as commonly practiced, wouldn't help people after death because initiates didn't understand what they were doing. Philosophy offered a different path to wisdom and immortality, one based on reason rather than secret rituals. Yet philosophers also borrowed from mysteries. Plato presents philosophical enlightenment using mystery language. In the Symposium, Diotima describes the philosophical ascent to beauty itself as an initiation into mysteries. The Allegory of the Cave, with its journey from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge, echoes mystery initiation. Philosophy became, in a sense, a rational mystery cult, promising salvation through understanding rather than through ritual. Some philosophers underwent actual initiation into mysteries. Socrates was probably initiated at Eleusis, as most Athenian citizens were. This didn't contradict his rationalism. The mysteries weren't understood as competing with reason, but as complementing it. They offered experiential knowledge that couldn't be communicated in words. Philosophy offered conceptual understanding that could be taught and argued about. Both were valuable. The mysteries also influenced early Christianity. The Christian concept of baptism as death and rebirth resembles mystery initiation. The Eucharist, with its sacred meal and transformation, echoes mystery rituals. Paul uses mystery language when describing Christian revelation. The distinction between outer teachings for everyone and inner teachings for initiates appears in both mysteries and early Christianity. Orphism specifically influenced Christian theology. The idea of original sin, the soul imprisoned in the body, salvation through purification. These concepts entered Christianity partly through Orphic channels. Church fathers like Clement of Alexandria and Augustine were familiar with Orphic teachings and transformed them into Christian doctrine. The secrecy surrounding mysteries makes them difficult to study. We have external descriptions, we have hints from initiates, we have ritual objects and artistic representations, but we don't have the core teachings. It's like trying to understand Catholicism without ever witnessing Mass or reading the Bible. We can reconstruct something, but crucial elements remain mysterious. This secrecy was deliberate and meaningful. The mysteries taught that some knowledge cannot be communicated verbally. It must be experienced. Telling someone about initiation isn't the same as being initiated. The ineffable experience, whatever exactly it was, required direct participation. This idea that some truths transcend language influenced later mysticism, both pagan and Christian. The mysteries also offered something philosophy struggled to provide: emotional satisfaction and religious community. Philosophy appealed to the intellect, it promised understanding. But humans need more than understanding. They need ritual, community, emotional connection to the sacred. The mysteries provided this. They gave people experiences that changed them, that gave them hope, that connected them to something greater than themselves. When Christianity became dominant and pagan temples were closed, the mysteries ended. The Eleusinian sanctuary was destroyed in the late 4th century. CE Orphic practices faded away. The knowledge that initiates had guarded for over 1,000 years was lost. What they experienced in those secret ceremonies, what they saw that gave them such certainty about death, we'll never know for certain. The mysteries kept their secrets to the end. Anaxagoras and the mind. Anaxagoras came from Clazomenae in Asia Minor but spent most of his career in Athens. He was the first important philosopher to work in Athens, arriving around 480 BCE and staying for about 30 years. He brought Ionian natural philosophy to Athens and influenced a generation of Athenian intellectuals, including Pericles, Euripides, and possibly Socrates. Anaxagoras proposed a distinctive solution to the problem that had troubled earlier philosophers. How can there be change if being cannot come from non-being? His answer was that everything exists in everything. Every substance contains portions of every other substance. What we call a pure substance, like gold or water, is actually a mixture where one ingredient predominates overwhelmingly, but tiny portions of everything else are present too. This sounds strange until you consider what motivated it. When you eat bread and it becomes flesh, where does the flesh come from? It can't come from nothing. It can't have been created. So it must have already existed in the bread, just in proportions too small to dominate. The bread contains tiny portions of flesh, bone, blood, and everything else. Digestion rearranges the proportions, causing flesh portions to predominate in some parts of the mixture. Anaxagoras called the fundamental ingredients seeds, or in later terminology, homeomeres, meaning things with like parts. Gold seeds are all gold. Flesh seeds are all flesh. Each seed is infinitely divisible, meaning no matter how small a piece you take, it's still that substance. There's no level of atoms or fundamental particles. Every portion contains every substance in some proportion. This theory explains mixture and separation without requiring creation or destruction. Apparent change is really just rearrangement. The ingredients were always there. What changes is which ones predominate in which mixtures. This preserved the Parmenidean principle that being cannot come from non-being while explaining how change is possible. But Anaxagoras introduced something else, something radically new. He proposed that mind, which he called nous, is a distinct substance that controls the cosmic process. Mind isn't mixed with other things. It's pure and unmixed. It has complete knowledge of everything. It initiated the rotation that organized the cosmos, separating things out from the original mixture. This was revolutionary. Earlier philosophers explained everything through mechanical processes. The atomists had atoms and void. The Pythagoreans had numbers, Heraclitus had fire. But Anaxagoras introduced intelligence as a cosmic principle. Mind understands and directs. It's not just another ingredient, but something fundamentally different, something that knows and purposes. Plato and Aristotle both praised Anaxagoras for introducing mind, but criticized him for not using it properly. According to Aristotle, Anaxagoras mentioned mind at the beginning as the cause of cosmic order, but then explained specific phenomena through mechanical causes without mentioning mind again. It was like introducing an intelligent director, but then explaining the play as if the actors just randomly moved around. Plato makes the same complaint in the Phaedo. Anaxagoras promised to explain things teleologically, in terms of purposes, but actually explained them mechanically. Whether this criticism is fair is debatable. Anaxagoras may have thought mind's role was to initiate cosmic rotation, after which mechanical processes take over, or he may have thought that understanding the mechanical processes is understanding how mind operates, that mind works through natural laws. Either way, introducing mind as a cosmic principle was historically important, even if Anaxagoras didn't develop it as later philosophers wished. Anaxagoras' scientific claims got him in trouble. He taught that the sun is not a god, but a hot stone larger than the Peloponnese. The moon shines by reflected sunlight, and has mountains and valleys like Earth. Eclipses occur when the moon passes between Earth and sun, or when Earth's shadow falls on the moon. These were naturalistic explanations that contradicted traditional religion. Around 450 BCE, Anaxagoras was prosecuted for impiety. The specific charges were that he denied the gods and taught that the sun is a stone and the moon is earth. This was partly a political attack on his patron Pericles, the leading Athenian statesman. Attacking Pericles' associates was a way to attack Pericles when direct attacks were difficult. According to different accounts, Anaxagoras was either convicted and exiled or fled Athens before trial. He settled in Lampsacus, a Greek city on the Hellespont, where he founded a school and lived until his death around 428 BCE. The city honored him after his death, and citizens celebrated an annual holiday for children in his memory. The trial of Anaxagoras established a dangerous precedent. It showed that natural philosophy could be prosecuted as impiety, teaching that celestial bodies are not gods but natural objects, that divine intervention isn't needed to explain phenomena. This could get you charged with atheism. This precedent may have influenced the later prosecution of Socrates, who was also charged with not recognizing the city's gods. Anaxagoras influenced Athenian intellectual life significantly. Pericles studied with him and reportedly credited Anaxagoras with teaching him to think clearly and speak effectively. Euripides, the tragedian, shows Anaxagoras' influence in his plays, which often question traditional religious ideas and present naturalistic explanations for events. Whether Socrates knew Anaxagoras personally is uncertain. In Plato's Phaedo, Socrates says he was excited when he heard that Anaxagoras claimed mind orders everything, thinking this meant Anaxagoras would explain things teleologically. But reading Anaxagoras' book disappointed Socrates because Anaxagoras explained things mechanically. This may be historical or may be Plato's invention to contrast Socratic teleology with pre-Socratic mechanism. Anaxagoras' theory of mind influenced later developments. Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover, the divine intelligence that causes cosmic motion by being the object of desire and thought, owes something to Anaxagoras. The Stoic logos as intelligent cosmic principle resembles Anaxagorean mind. Christian theology's emphasis on divine intelligence ordering creation shows distant influence from this philosophical tradition. The theory that everything is in everything, though it seems strange, anticipated some modern insights. Chemistry shows that complex substances are made from combinations of simpler elements. Tracing any compound back far enough, you find that the same basic elements appear everywhere, just in different proportions. This isn't what Anaxagoras meant, but it's not entirely unlike it either. Anaxagoras exemplified the shift from pre-Socratic cosmology to Socratic and Platonic concern with mind and intelligence. He kept the pre-Socratic commitment to naturalistic explanation while introducing intelligence as a cosmic principle. He bridged the gap between Ionian materialism and Athenian emphasis on reason and soul. His prosecution showed the dangers of challenging traditional belief, but also established philosophy's right to investigate nature despite religious opposition. Empedocles, the Four Elements. Empedocles of Acragas in Sicily, who lived around 495 to 435 BCE, was one of the most colorful figures in ancient philosophy. He was a philosopher, a poet, a physician, and apparently something of a showman who claimed miraculous powers. Ancient sources describe him wearing purple robes, bronze sandals, and a golden crown, traveling from city to city, performing wonders, and teaching his philosophy in elaborate verse. Empedocles proposed that reality consists of four eternal, unchangeable elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Nothing is ever truly created or destroyed. What we call birth and death, creation and destruction, are really just different arrangements of these four elements. Everything that exists is a mixture of the four elements in various proportions. Bone is half water, 2 parts earth, and 2 parts fire. Flesh is equal parts of all four. Blood is nearly equal parts of all four, which is why we think with blood. This theory of four elements dominated Western science and medicine for over 2,000 years. It was adopted by Aristotle, elaborated by later philosophers, and remained standard until the development of modern chemistry. When we talk about the elements today, we're using terminology that goes back to Empedocles, even though modern elements are completely different things. But Empedocles added something distinctive. The four elements don't just randomly mix and separate. Two cosmic forces govern their movement: love and strife. Love brings things together, causing the elements to mix. Strife separates them, pulling mixtures apart. These aren't psychological feelings, but cosmic principles, something like attraction and repulsion in physics. But Empedocles described them in emotional, almost mythological terms. The cosmos goes through an eternal cycle driven by love and strife. When love dominates completely, all four elements are perfectly mixed in a uniform sphere called the spheros, where everything is united in harmony. Then strife begins to penetrate, separating the elements. As strife increases, separation continues until the elements are completely separated into four distinct layers. Then love begins to dominate again, mixing the elements. The cycle continues eternally. Our world exists during the intermediate phases, when love and strife are balanced. Neither complete unity nor complete separation produces a cosmos with distinct objects. Only in the middle phases, when mixing and separating are both occurring, do we get the complex world we experience. Empedocles thought we currently live in the phase where strife is increasing and things are gradually separating. Empedocles explained biological development through this cosmic process. In the early phase of our world cycle, when love was stronger, random body parts formed from the elements mixing heads without necks, arms without shoulders, eyes without faces. These parts wandered around separately. Then they started combining randomly, creatures with human heads on ox bodies, bulls with human faces. All sorts of combinations appeared. Most of these combinations couldn't survive. A creature with eyes on its back couldn't see where it was going. A creature with no mouth couldn't eat. These combinations died out. Only combinations that happened to be viable survived and reproduced. Over time, this led to the forms of life we see today. This is remarkably similar to natural selection, though Empedocles explained it through cosmic forces rather than through heredity and competition. Empedocles believed in reincarnation. The soul moves from body to body, born again in different forms, human and animal. He claimed to remember his past lives. He wrote, "For already have I once been a boy and a girl, a bush and a bird and a dumb fish in the sea." The soul's imprisonment in flesh results from ancient crime souls that have sinned, must wander for 30,000 years, being born in different mortal forms, until they're finally purified and can return to the gods. This belief shaped his ethics. Killing and eating animals is murder and cannibalism, because animals contain reincarnated human souls. He wrote emotionally about sacrifice. "Will you not cease from this harsh-sounding slaughter? Do you not see that you are devouring one another in thoughtlessness of mind?" He advocated vegetarianism and condemned all killing. The legends about Empedocles are extraordinary and mostly unbelievable. He supposedly brought a woman back to life after she'd been dead for 30 days. He controlled winds to protect crops. He demonstrated his divinity through various wonders. Whether he claimed these powers, whether he performed clever tricks that seem miraculous, or whether the stories were entirely invented by later writers is impossible to determine. The most famous legend concerns his death. According to the story, Empedocles climbed Mount Etna, the great volcano in Sicily, and jumped into the crater to prove he was divine. The volcano would consume his body, and people would think he'd been taken up by the gods. But the volcano threw out one of his bronze sandals, revealing what really happened. This story is almost certainly fiction, probably invented to mock Empedocles' supposed arrogance, but it became the most famous thing about him. Empedocles wrote 2 major poems, On Nature and Purifications. Substantial fragments survive, about 450 lines total, which is more than we have from most pre-Socratics. His poetry is powerful and strange, mixing natural philosophy with religious and mystical themes. He wrote in the meter Homer used, giving his cosmology epic grandeur. The relationship between his two poems is puzzling. On Nature presents his scientific cosmology with the four elements, love and strife, and the cosmic cycle Purifications presents his religious views about reincarnation, sin, and purification. These seem like different philosophical systems. Some scholars think they represent different periods in Empedocles' thought. Others think he was trying to integrate science and religion, showing how understanding the cosmos relates to purifying the soul. Later philosophers responded to Empedocles in various ways. Aristotle adopted the four elements, but rejected love and strife as cosmic forces, replacing them with more abstract concepts of form and privation. He also added a fifth element, ether, for celestial bodies. The Stoics kept the four elements and developed Empedocles' idea that cosmic cycles repeat eternally. Medieval and Renaissance philosophy continued using the four-element theory in physics and medicine. Empedocles' explanation of perception was influential. He thought perception occurs when effluences from objects enter pores in sense organs. Vision happens when something comes off the seen object and enters the eye. Like perceives like. The earth in us perceives earth in objects. The water in us perceives water, and so on. This crude materialism was criticized but remained influential. His biology, despite the bizarre theory of random body parts combining, showed careful observation. He understood that plants reproduce sexually. He recognized fossils as remains of ancient life. He knew that breathing involves not just the lungs but pores in the skin. His medical knowledge was apparently substantial, and later physicians drew on his work. The combination of scientific naturalism and religious mysticism in Empedocles reflects tensions in Greek thought generally. How does natural philosophy relate to religious belief? Can you explain the world mechanically while maintaining that soul and divinity matter? Empedocles tried to have both, creating a system where cosmic forces operate deterministically, but where individual souls face moral choices with eternal consequences. Modern readers often find Empedocles appealing because he seems more poetic and imaginative than other pre-Socratics. Love and strife as cosmic forces are more vivid than Anaximander's abstract apeiron, or the atomist's mechanical collisions. The image of random body parts wandering around and combining is memorably bizarre. The dramatic legend of jumping into a volcano captures the imagination, even if it's fiction. But Empedocles was also a serious natural philosopher who tried to explain reality systematically using testable principles. His four elements weren't arbitrary, they corresponded to observable states: solid, liquid, gas, and energy. His cosmic cycle explained both unity and diversity, both permanence and change. His biology, however strange its mechanisms, recognized that life forms develop over time and that only viable forms survive. These are real scientific insights embedded in mythological language. The Milesians, first natural philosophers. Philosophy, as distinct from mythology, began in Miletus, a wealthy Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor. In the 6th century BCE, three Milesian thinkers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, asked a new kind of question: what is the fundamental nature of reality? Instead of answering with stories about gods, they proposed natural principles that could be investigated through reason and observation. Thales, who lived around 624 to 546 BCE, is traditionally called the first philosopher. He was also a mathematician, astronomer, and engineer. He predicted a solar eclipse, possibly the one in 585 BCE. He supposedly used geometry to calculate the height of pyramids and the distance of ships at sea. He advised political leaders and became wealthy through a clever speculation in olive presses. Thales proposed that water is the fundamental principle of all things. Everything is ultimately water or derived from water. This seems simplistic, but consider what Thales might have observed. Water takes different forms: liquid, solid ice, gaseous steam. Living things need water. Seeds sprout when watered. Land emerges from sea. The Nile floods and deposits fertile soil. Water seems to be everywhere, and to transform into everything. More importantly, Thales was proposing that reality has a unified nature that can be understood. Instead of explaining each phenomenon through a different god's action, he suggested one principle underlies everything. This shift from mythological to naturalistic explanation marks the beginning of philosophy and science. Thales also claimed that all things are full of gods. This sounds contradictory to his naturalism, but he probably meant that nature itself is divine, that matter has inherent properties that make it move and change without external divine intervention. He apparently thought magnets show this because they move iron without being pushed. The cosmos is alive and intelligent throughout. Anaximander, Thales' younger colleague, lived from about 610 to 546 BCE. He rejected Thales' theory that everything is water. His reasoning was sophisticated. If everything comes from water, then water's opposites, like fire, would ultimately be water. But fire destroys water. How can something be identical with what it destroys? The fundamental principle can't be any particular element because elements have opposites. Anaximander proposed instead that the arche, the fundamental principle, is the apeiron, the unlimited or indefinite. This isn't any particular substance we experience, but something prior to all particular substances. It's spatially infinite, temporally eternal, and qualitatively indefinite. Everything comes from the apeiron and returns to it. This is remarkably abstract. Anaximander moved from explaining the world through familiar substances like water to positing something we never directly experience. The apeiron is known only through reasoning, not through observation. This represents a major philosophical advance, showing that reality might differ fundamentally from appearance. Anaximander described how the cosmos formed from the apeiron, something like a seed separated out, containing both hot and cold. The hot formed a sphere of fire around the cold earth. The fire sphere broke into rings that we see as sun, moon, and stars. What we see as heavenly bodies are actually holes in these rings through which fire shows eclipses occur when the holes temporarily close. He also proposed an early evolutionary theory. Life began in the sea. Humans descended from fish-like creatures. He reasoned that human infants can't survive on their own, unlike young animals, so early humans must have developed inside other creatures, like certain sharks that give birth to live young. This shows Anaximander thinking about biological problems and proposing naturalistic solutions. Anaximander produced the first map of the known world and built a model showing the positions of celestial bodies. He wrote what may have been the first philosophical prose text in Greek, though only one sentence survives. From which things is the origin for existing things, to those also does destruction happen according to necessity, for they pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice according to the assessment of time. This fragment uses legal and ethical language to describe natural processes. Things that come into existence commit injustice by existing separately. They must pay penalty by returning to the apeiron. This suggests Anaximander saw cosmic order as analogous to legal order, with natural laws governing processes the way human laws govern society. Anaximenes, the third Milesian, lived from about 585 to 528 BCE. He was a younger colleague of Anaximander. Like Thales, he identified the arche with a particular substance, but he chose air. Everything is ultimately air at different densities. Rarefied air becomes fire, condensed air becomes wind, then cloud, then water, then earth, then stone. All change is explained through rarefaction and condensation. This theory improved on Thales by explaining how one substance becomes others through a clear mechanism. It improved on Anaximander by identifying the arche with something observable rather than something completely abstract. Air is everywhere, invisible but detectable, necessary for life. Breath seems connected to soul and life. When you die, your breath leaves. So identifying the fundamental principle with air made intuitive sense. Anaximenes explained various phenomena through his theory. Earthquakes occur because Earth dries out and breaks, or gets excessively wet and crumbles. Celestial bodies are fiery and ride on air like leaves. Stars don't give heat because they're too far away. The Earth floats on air like a lid. These explanations are wrong, but show systematic attempt to explain phenomena using the basic principle. All three Milesians shared key assumptions that defined the new philosophical approach. Reality has an underlying unity despite apparent diversity. This unity can be understood through reason and observation. Natural phenomena have natural causes that operate regularly. Understanding requires finding general principles, not just cataloging particular facts. The cosmos is ordered and intelligible. Why did philosophy begin in Miletus specifically? The city was wealthy from trade, providing leisure for intellectual activity. It was a crossroads exposing Greeks to other cultures, encouraging critical thinking about their own traditions. It had no dominant priesthood that might suppress questioning. The political system was relatively open, allowing discussion and debate. The Milesians had no word for philosophy or philosopher. They were investigating nature, physis in Greek. Later tradition called them the first natural philosophers, or physiologoi. They weren't trying to found a new discipline, but simply asking questions that occurred to them and proposing answers based on reasoning and observation. Their influence was enormous. They established that natural phenomena should be explained naturally. They showed that reason can discover truths about reality. They initiated systematic inquiry into nature that continued through later Pre-Socratics and eventually developed into science. Every philosopher who came after them was responding to questions they first asked and methods they first developed. The Milesians left no complete texts. We know them through later later reports and a few fragments. This makes interpretation difficult. Did Thales really say everything is water, or is this a later summary of more complex views? What exactly did Anaximander mean by the Epeiron? How detailed were Anaximenes' explanations? We can't be certain. But what we can say is that around 600 BCE in Miletus, some people started thinking about the world in a new way. Instead of accepting mythological explanations, they asked what things are really made of. Instead of invoking gods, they looked for natural principles. Instead of treating each phenomenon separately, they sought underlying unity. This was the beginning of philosophy, the beginning of science, the beginning of systematic rational inquiry into nature. Everything that came after built on this foundation. Parmenides, nothing ever changes. Parmenides of Elea, born around 515 BCE in southern Italy, proposed one of the most radical and counterintuitive theories in the history of philosophy. He argued that change is impossible, that motion is an illusion, that the many things we see are really one thing, and that the reality our senses show us is fundamentally deceptive. Everything that exists has always existed and will always exist, unchanging and eternal. This seems obviously wrong. We see things change constantly. People are born and die. Seasons change. Objects move. Yet Parmenides argued through pure logic that all of this is illusion. His reasoning forced every subsequent philosopher to either refute him or accept his bizarre conclusions. The entire development of Greek philosophy after Parmenides was shaped by responses to his arguments. Parmenides wrote a philosophical poem divided into two parts. The first part, called The Way of Truth, presents his positive philosophy through rigorous logical argument. The second part, The Way of Opinion, describes the illusory world of appearance. A goddess speaks to Parmenides as narrator, revealing truth to him. This framing as divine revelation is ironic because the content is pure rational argument with no appeal to religious authority. The central argument begins from a simple premise. What is. What is not. This seems like an empty tautology, but Parmenides drew profound conclusions from it. Consider what happens when something comes into being. It either comes from what is or from what is not. It cannot come from what is not, because what is not does not exist, and nothing can come from nothing. But it cannot come from what is either, because what is already exists, so nothing new is created. Therefore, nothing can come into being. The same reasoning applies to destruction. For something to cease existing, it must either become what is or become what is not. It cannot become what is not, because what is not does not exist. It cannot become what is because it already is. Therefore, nothing can cease existing. If nothing can come into being or cease existing, then everything that exists has always existed and will always exist. There is no creation, no destruction, no change. What is eternal and unchanging. Parmenides extended this reasoning to motion. For something to move, it must go somewhere it is not currently. But to go where it is not means to go into non-being. Since non-being does not exist, motion is impossible. Everything is where it is and cannot be anywhere else. He also argued against plurality. If there are many things, there must be something that separates them, something between them. That something would have to be either being or non-being. It cannot be non-being because non-being does not exist. But if it is being, then it doesn't separate things but connects them. Therefore, there cannot really be many things. What exists is one, continuous and undivided. This one being must be complete and perfect. It cannot have any lack or need because lack would be non-being. It must be the same in every part because difference would require non-being. It has no beginning or end in time because that would involve non-being at those boundaries. It has no boundaries in space for the same reason. It is like a perfect sphere, everywhere equally real, with no variation or gaps. Parmenides described the characteristics of true being: ungenerated, imperishable, whole, unique, immovable, complete. It was and will be not, since it is now altogether one, continuous. These characteristics apply not to individual things, but to being itself, the single unified reality that underlies illusory appearances. The implications are staggering. Everything we experience through our senses is wrong. There is no motion, no change, no multiplicity, no birth or death. The world of everyday experience is, in Parmenides' terms, the way of opinion, a realm of mortal beliefs where things seem to change but nothing is truly real. Why do we experience this illusory world? Parmenides' explanation in the way of opinion is unclear and possibly ironic. He describes a cosmology involving light and night as fundamental principles, but scholars debate whether he believed any of this or was showing how people construct false beliefs about reality. The philosophical impact was immense. Most philosophers found Parmenides' conclusions unacceptable, but his arguments difficult to refute. The atomists Democritus and Lyceum accepted that being cannot come from non-being, but proposed that reality consists of atoms that rearrange without being created or destroyed. Empedocles accepted that nothing is created or destroyed, but said the four elements mix and separate. Anaxagoras said everything is in everything, and apparent change is rearrangement. Plato engaged deeply with Parmenides. His theory of forms can be seen as trying to reconcile Parmenides with common sense. The forms, like Parmenidean being, are eternal and unchanging. The physical world, like the way of opinion, is changeable and less real. But unlike Parmenides, Plato maintained that the physical world has some reality, though it's derivative from the forms. Aristotle devoted substantial effort to refuting Parmenides. He distinguished different senses of being and different ways things can change. He argued that Parmenides equivocated between absolute non-being and relative non-being. When something changes from cold to hot, it doesn't become absolute non-being, but merely stops being cold. This distinction allowed Aristotle to accept that being cannot come from absolute non-being while maintaining that change is real. Modern philosophers and physicists continue engaging with Parmenidean ideas. The block universe theory in physics, which treats time as a dimension and suggests all moments exist equally, resembles Parmenides' eternal unchanging being. Metaphysical debates about whether change is fundamental or whether the world is really a static four-dimensional structure echo Parmenidean arguments. Parmenides also influenced logic and epistemology. He distinguished clearly between reason and sense experience, arguing that reason alone can discover truth while senses deceive. He emphasized the importance of logical consistency and following arguments wherever they lead, even to counterintuitive conclusions. This commitment to logic over observation became characteristic of rationalist philosophy. His student Zeno of Elea, who we discussed earlier, defended Parmenides by showing that belief in motion and plurality leads to paradoxes. Zeno's paradoxes were designed to show that if you reject Parmenides' monism, you face even worse problems. This strategy of defending a theory by showing that alternatives face difficulties became standard in philosophy. The historical Parmenides was also a lawgiver. He wrote laws for his city Elea that were reportedly still in use centuries later. This combination of abstract metaphysical reasoning and practical political activity is characteristic of early Greek philosophers who didn't separate philosophy from life. Whether Parmenides actually believed his conclusions is debated. Some scholars think he was serious, that logical reasoning forced him to conclude reality is nothing like it appears. Others think he was exploring how far logic can go, showing that pure reason without empirical checks leads to absurdity. Still others think he was deliberately provocative, challenging his readers to find the flaw in arguments that lead to impossible conclusions. What's undeniable is that Parmenides changed philosophy permanently. Before him, philosophers proposed various substances or principles as fundamental. After him, they had to address logical arguments about being, non-being, change, and unity. They had to explain how change is possible if something cannot come from nothing. They had to reconcile the logical demand for permanence with the empirical observation of change. Parmenides showed that philosophy is not just theorizing about nature, but also examining the logical structure of thought itself. His arguments forced philosophers to become more rigorous, to examine their assumptions, to distinguish different meanings and avoid equivocation. He established that philosophy must follow arguments wherever they lead, that logical consistency matters more than common sense, and that reality might be radically different from appearance. Protagoras, man is the measure. Protagoras of Abdera, born around 490 BCE, was the most famous and successful of the Sophists. He traveled throughout the Greek world teaching rhetoric and philosophy for substantial fees. He claimed he could teach virtue and make people better citizens. Unlike other sophists who faced criticism, Protagoras was generally respected. Even Plato, hostile to most sophists, portrayed him somewhat sympathetically in the dialogue that bears his name. Protagoras is famous for the statement, "Man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not." This brief sentence has generated endless interpretation and controversy. What exactly does it mean, and what are its implications? The most straightforward interpretation is relativism. What is true for you is what seems true to you. What is true for me is what seems true to me. There is no objective truth independent of individual perception and judgment. When you say wine tastes sweet and I say it tastes bitter, we're both right because we're each reporting our own experience. The wine is sweet for you and bitter for me. This extends beyond taste to everything. Ethical values are relative to individuals or cultures. What seems just in Athens may seem unjust in Sparta. What seems beautiful to Greeks may seem ugly to Persians. There is no universal standard to judge between these different perspectives. Each person or culture is the measure of what is true and good for them. This relativism was radical and threatening to traditional morality. If there is no objective right and wrong, then ethical education becomes impossible. How can Protagoras claim to teach virtue if virtue is whatever seems virtuous to each person? If justice is just whatever seems just to whoever has power, then might makes right, and there is no basis for criticizing tyrants. Protagoras apparently recognized these problems and tried to address them. In Plato's dialogue, he tells a myth about how humans acquired political art from the gods. Zeus gave all humans a sense of shame and justice so they could live together in cities. This natural moral sense is universal, not relative. Protagoras could then claim to teach people how to develop and articulate this natural moral sense more effectively. But this seems inconsistent with radical relativism. If there is a natural universal moral sense, then moral truth is not relative to individuals. Protagoras may have held a more moderate position than the most extreme interpretation suggests. Perhaps he meant that within the framework of shared human nature, different individuals and cultures develop different but equally legitimate value systems. Another interpretation focuses on the epistemological rather than ethical implications. Protagoras may have been making a point about knowledge rather than values. We can only know how things appear to us. We cannot step outside our own perspective to see things as they truly are, independent of perception. Therefore, the way things seem to each person is, for that person, how things are. This is consistent with Protagoras' other known views. He was skeptical about knowledge of the gods. He wrote, "Concerning the gods, I cannot know whether they exist or not, nor what form they might have. Many things prevent knowledge, including the obscurity of the subject and the shortness of human life." This agnosticism about religion was controversial and dangerous. The book containing this statement was reportedly burned in Athens, and Protagoras may have been prosecuted for impiety. Whether he was actually tried and exiled, or whether these are later legends, is unclear, but his religious skepticism was remembered and criticized. In a traditional religious society, claiming you cannot know whether gods exist was close to atheism. Protagoras' teaching method involved anti-logic, arguing both sides of every question. He claimed he could make the weaker argument the stronger. This meant he could take a losing position in a debate and through rhetorical skill make it win. This ability was valuable for students who would participate in legal and political debates, but it disturbed those who thought truth should determine which argument wins, not rhetorical cleverness. Critics argued that if you can argue either side of any question equally well, then truth doesn't matter. Only persuasion matters. This reduces philosophy and ethics to mere verbal tricks. It also suggests cynicism about whether truth exists at all. If any position can be defended as well as its opposite, maybe no position is actually true. Protagoras apparently disagreed. He thought that even if absolute truth is unknowable, some beliefs are more useful than others. The wise person is not someone who knows absolute truth, but someone who can change beliefs that are harmful into beliefs that are beneficial. The physician, for example, changes the patient's state from unhealthy to healthy. Neither state is truer than the other, but one is better. Similarly, the teacher changes the student's beliefs from less useful to more useful. This pragmatic approach to truth and value influenced later philosophy. If what matters is usefulness rather than correspondence to reality, then we should judge beliefs by their consequences rather than by trying to determine whether they accurately represent an objective world. This anticipates pragmatist philosophy developed in the modern period. Protagoras charged high fees for his teaching, reportedly 10,000 drachmas for a complete course. This was an enormous sum, equivalent to years of income for a working person. He justified this by claiming his teaching was worth it. He supposedly offered students a guarantee: pay the fee after you've completed the course, and only if you judge that you've received value equal to what you paid. This shows confidence in his teaching and understanding of his relativist position. If you are the measure, then your judgment about the value you receive determines what it's worth. A famous story, possibly apocryphal, tells of Protagoras suing his student Euathlus. Euathlus had agreed to pay Protagoras' fee after winning his first court case, but Euathlus delayed starting his legal career, avoiding payment. Protagoras sued him. Protagoras argued, if I win the case, Euathlus must pay by court order. If I lose, Euathlus must pay because he won his first case. Either way, he must pay. Euathlus countered, if I win, I owe nothing by court order. If I lose, I haven't won my first case yet, so I still owe nothing. Either way, I pay nothing. The paradox shows Protagoras teaching his student perhaps too well. Protagoras' influence on Greek education was substantial. He helped establish rhetoric as a teachable skill with systematic techniques. He analyzed language and developed grammar. He apparently distinguished different types of sentences, questions, statements, commands, prayers. This early work in linguistic analysis contributed to later grammatical theory. His relativism posed problems that philosophers still debate. If truth is relative, is the statement "truth is relative" itself relative? If so, then it's only true for those who believe it, which means it's not universally true, which contradicts itself. This self-referential paradox troubled ancient critics and continues to trouble modern relativists. Plato's extended critique of Protagoras and the Theaetetus examines whether knowledge can be defined as perception, which seems to follow from Protagorean relativism. Plato argues that this definition fails because it cannot account for memory, error, or expertise. If everyone is the measure, then the doctor's opinion about health is no better than the patient's, which is absurd. Aristotle criticized Protagorean relativism for violating the law of non-contradiction. If something can be both true and false relative to different observers, then contradictory statements can both be true, which Aristotle thought destroyed the possibility of rational discourse. Despite these criticisms, Protagoras raised important questions that remain relevant. How do we know that our perceptions correspond to reality? Is there an objective truth independent of human judgment? And if so, how can we access it? Are values objective or culturally constructed? Can we teach virtue? And if so, what justifies claiming that what we teach is truly virtuous? These questions don't have easy answers. Protagoras may have been wrong in thinking man is the measure of all things, but his challenge forced philosophers to articulate more carefully what they mean by truth, knowledge, and value, and on what basis they make claims to no objective reality. That contribution to philosophy was substantial, even if his specific doctrines were rejected. Gorgias. Nothing exists. Gorgias of Leontini in Sicily, born around 485 BCE, was a sophist who combined brilliant rhetorical skill with radical skeptical philosophy. He's remembered for three outrageous claims. Nothing exists. If anything did exist, it could not be known, and if it could be known, it could not be communicated. This triple denial of existence, knowledge, and communication represents perhaps the most extreme skepticism in ancient philosophy. Whether Gorgias was serious or whether this was elaborate parody remains debated. The arguments appear in a work called On Non-Being or On Nature, which seems to mock Parmenides' On Nature. Where Parmenides proved that only one unchanging being exists, Gorgias proved the opposite, that nothing exists. The arguments are so clever and so absurd that they might be philosophy or they might be satire showing that arguments can prove anything. The first argument, that nothing exists, proceeds systematically. Either being exists or non-being exists, or both exist. But non-being cannot exist because non-being means not existing. If non-being existed, it would both be and not be, which is impossible, so non-being does not exist. Does being exist then? If being exists, it must be either eternal or generated. If eternal, it has no beginning, and therefore extends infinitely in time. But what is infinite cannot exist anywhere, because existing somewhere means having boundaries. If being is nowhere, it is nothing. So if being is eternal, it does not exist. If being is generated, it must come from either being or non-being. It cannot come from non-being because non-being does not exist. It cannot come from being because then nothing new is generated. It already was. So being cannot be generated. Since being can neither be eternal nor generated, being does not exist. What if both being and non-being exist? But we already showed that non-being cannot exist, and that being cannot exist, so both cannot exist together. Therefore, nothing exists. This argument deliberately mirrors and parodies Parmenidean logic. Parmenides used similar reasoning to prove that only eternal unchanging being exists. Gorgias takes the same tools and reaches the opposite conclusion. The implication seems to be that pure logical argument, divorced from experience, can prove anything, and therefore proves nothing. The second argument, that if anything exists, it cannot be known, assumes, for the sake of argument, that things do exist. Gorgias argues that what we think is not necessarily what exists. We can think of flying horses and chariots racing across the sea, but these don't exist. If thought corresponded to reality, then everything we think would exist, including impossible things. Since impossible things don't exist even though we think them, thought and reality are separate. Therefore, even if things exist, we cannot know them through thought. Furthermore, we think through concepts and images in our minds. These mental contents are different from external objects. The stone in my mind is not the actual stone. Therefore, what I know is mental content, not the external object. Even if external objects exist, I cannot know them because what I access in thought is mental representation, not the object itself. This argument raises serious epistemological problems that later philosophers struggled with. How can knowledge bridge the gap between mind and world? If all we have access to is mental content, how can we know it corresponds to external reality? This problem of the veil of perception troubled philosophers from ancient times through Descartes to contemporary epistemology. The third argument, that if anything could be known, it could not be communicated, assumes for the sake of argument that both existence and knowledge are possible. Gorgias argues that communication occurs through language, but language is different from the things it describes. Words are not things. The word fire is not hot. The word stone is not hard. Therefore, what we communicate through language is words, not things. Furthermore, each person's experience is private. When I see something, you cannot see my seeing. When I hear something, you cannot hear my hearing. Even if I could know external objects, and even if I could describe them in language, you would only receive my words, not my experience. The words might produce some experience in you, but it would be your experience, not mine. Therefore, even if knowledge is possible, communication of knowledge is impossible. This third argument points to genuine problems in communication. When I say red, do you experience the same thing I experience? We've both learned to call certain things red, but that doesn't prove our experiences match. The question of whether one person's qualia, subjective experiences, match another person's remains philosophically difficult. Gorgias's arguments were taken seriously enough that Aristotle felt obligated to refute them. Aristotle argued that Gorgias equivocated between different senses of being and existence. He also argued that Gorgias confused thought about things with the things themselves. The fact that I can think impossible things doesn't show that thought and reality are completely separate, only that thought can go beyond what actually exists. But Gorgias's rhetorical career suggests he didn't actually believe his own skeptical arguments. He traveled throughout Greece giving speeches and teaching rhetoric. He became famous for his elaborate style, using balanced clauses, poetic language, and rhythmic patterns. He charged enormous fees and became wealthy. All of this implies he believed communication is possible and effective. His most famous surviving speech is the Encomium of Helen, a defense of Helen of Troy. Traditional Greek thought blamed Helen for causing the Trojan War by running away with Paris. Gorgias argues that Helen deserves no blame because she acted either through divine compulsion, physical force, persuasion by speech, or overwhelming love. In each case, she was not responsible. The argument about persuasion is particularly interesting. Gorgias claims that speech is a powerful lord that can charm the soul and deceive judgment. If Helen was persuaded by Paris's words, she was compelled as surely as if she were physically forced. Speech can persuade against truth, making the worse argument seem better. Therefore, Helen is innocent. This defense of Helen is also a display of rhetorical skill and an advertisement for Gorgias's teaching. He's showing that he can argue any position persuasively, even one that challenges deeply held beliefs. He's also making a serious point about rhetoric's power. Speech can override reason and compel action. This power makes rhetoric both valuable and dangerous. Gorgias also wrote a defense of Palamedes, presenting the case of a Greek hero falsely accused of treason during the Trojan War. The speech demonstrates clever argumentation and became a model for forensic rhetoric. It shows how to construct a logical defense, anticipate counter-arguments, and appeal to the jury's emotions. In Plato's dialogue, Gorgias is portrayed as more moderate than his student Polus or his admirer Callicles. Gorgias claims rhetoric is a value-neutral tool that can be used well or badly. He admits that rhetoric teachers shouldn't be blamed if students use rhetoric badly, just as sword-fighting teachers shouldn't be blamed if students use their skills criminally. But Socrates pushes him, arguing that teaching powerful tools without ensuring they're used well is irresponsible. The historical relationship between Gorgias and Socrates is unknown. The dialogue was written decades after both were dead and reflects Plato's views more than historical fact. But it shows how 4th century Athenians perceived Gorgias as a brilliant teacher of rhetoric who was more interested in persuasion than truth. Gorgias reportedly lived to over 100 years old, remaining intellectually active until the end. His longevity, success, and influence suggest that whatever his philosophical skepticism, he believed in something. Perhaps his skeptical arguments were meant to liberate students from dogmatism. Perhaps they were meant to show that reason alone, without observation and common sense, leads to absurdity. Or perhaps they were simply displays of cleverness, showing off what arguments could do. Modern readers sometimes see Gorgias as anticipating postmodern skepticism about truth and reality. His arguments about the impossibility of knowledge and communication resemble later arguments that language creates reality rather than representing it, that truth is socially constructed, that objective knowledge is impossible. Whether this comparison is fair or anachronistic is debatable. What's clear is that Gorgias took seriously the gap between language and reality, between thought and world, between one person's experience and another's. These gaps are real philosophical problems that can't be easily dismissed. Even if Gorgias's extreme skepticism is wrong, his arguments identify genuine difficulties that any theory of knowledge and communication must address. Anaximander's infinite. Anaximander, who lived from about 610 to 546 BCE, made one of the most remarkable intellectual leaps in early philosophy. While his teacher Thales had proposed that water is the fundamental principle of reality, Anaximander proposed something no one had ever seen or touched, the apeiron, the infinite or indefinite. This abstraction represented a crucial step in philosophy's development. The word apeiron literally means unlimited or boundless. It can mean spatially infinite, temporally eternal, or qualitatively indefinite. Anaximander probably intended all three meanings. The apeiron has no spatial boundaries, no beginning or end in time, and no definite qualities like hot or cold, wet or dry. It's the source from which everything comes and to which everything returns, but it's unlike any particular thing that exists. Why did Anaximander reject Thales' simpler theory that everything is water? The reasoning shows sophisticated philosophical thinking. If water is the fundamental principle, then everything ultimately is water, including fire. But fire is the opposite of water. Fire destroys water, and water destroys fire. How can something be identical with its own opposite? This seemed logically impossible. The problem generalizes. Any particular element or substance has an opposite. Earth has air as opposite. Hot has cold. Wet has dry. If the fundamental principle were any particular substance, it would have to generate its opposite from itself, which seems impossible. Therefore, the fundamental principle cannot be any particular substance we experience. The apeiron solves this problem. Because it's indefinite and unlimited, it has no opposite. It's prior to all particular qualities and substances, hot and cold, wet and dry. All opposites exist potentially in the apeiron and separate out from it. The apeiron can generate opposites without contradiction, because it isn't identical with any particular thing. This move from concrete substance to abstract principle was philosophically revolutionary. Thales pointed to something everyone knows, water, and said reality is fundamentally, that Anaximander said reality is fundamentally something we never directly experience, something known only through reasoning about what must exist if opposites are to be generated without contradiction. Anaximander described the cosmos emerging from the apeiron through a process involving opposites separating out. Something containing both hot and cold separated from the apeiron. The hot formed a sphere of fire around the cold, moist earth. The fire sphere broke into rings, which we see as heavenly bodies. The sun, moon, and stars are actually holes in these rings through which fire shows. This cosmology is wrong in details, but shows systematic thinking. Anaximander tried to explain how complex cosmos emerges from simple beginning through natural processes. He used principles like hot and cold, which he could observe operating in nature, to explain cosmic structure. The model was mechanical and required no divine intervention beyond the initial existence of the apeiron. Anaximander also addressed biological origins. He thought life began in the sea. Humans descended from fish-like creatures. His reasoning shows careful thought about observed facts. Human infants are helpless and require extended care. They couldn't have survived in primitive conditions without protection. Therefore, early humans must have developed inside other creatures, the way some fish carry their young. This is an evolutionary theory of sorts, though completely different from modern evolution. Anaximander wasn't proposing natural selection or gradual modification. He apparently thought humans literally gestated inside fish-like creatures until they could survive independently. But the attempt to explain human origins naturalistically, through observation and reasoning, rather than mythology, was significant. The one surviving fragment from Anaximander's writing is philosophically rich. From which things is the origin for existing things, to those also does destruction happen according to necessity, for they pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice according to the assessment of time. This passage uses legal and moral language to describe natural processes. Things that separate from the apeiron commit injustice by existing separately. They must pay penalty by eventually returning to the apeiron. Time assesses the penalty like a judge. This legal metaphor suggests Anaximander saw cosmic order as analogous to social and legal order. The metaphor raises interesting questions. In what sense do separate things commit injustice? Presumably by existing separately, rather than remaining in undifferentiated unity, separation creates imbalance, privileging some qualities over others. Hot dominates in fire, cold in ice. This imbalance must be corrected. Things return to the apeiron, restoring balance. This conception influenced later Greek thought about justice and balance. The idea that natural processes involve restoring balance appears in medicine, where health means balanced humors. It appears in ethics, where virtue often means finding the mean between extremes. The Stoic concept of living according to nature involves accepting your role in the cosmic order. All of this traces partly to Anaximander's vision of cosmos as ordered system, where imbalance must be corrected. Anaximander made practical contributions beyond philosophy. He produced the first map of the inhabited world, though it hasn't survived. Ancient sources suggest it showed the Mediterranean Sea at center with Europe, Asia, and Libya surrounding it. The map was probably crude by later standards, but represented a systematic attempt to organize geographical knowledge. He also constructed a gnomon, a sundial that could tell time and determine solstices and equinoxes. He built a model showing positions of celestial bodies, an early planetarium. These practical projects show that early philosophy wasn't purely abstract speculation, but combined theoretical thinking with practical application. Anaximander's influence on later philosophy was substantial but indirect. His apeiron was probably too abstract for most people. Later philosophers returned to identifying the fundamental principle with particular substances or with multiple elements, but the idea that reality's fundamental nature might be something we don't directly experience, something known only through reasoning, became central to philosophy. Plato's forms are like Anaximander's apeiron in being abstract, known through reason rather than sense, and prior to particular things. Aristotle's prime matter, pure potentiality without any actual qualities, resembles the apeiron. Modern physics's quantum fields, or the energy that takes different forms, are distant descendants of this idea that reality is fundamentally something unlike the particular things we observe. The concept of the infinite itself became philosophically important. Is the universe infinite in space and time? Can infinite series exist? Can there be actual infinities or only potential infinities? These questions, debated throughout philosophy and mathematics, trace back to Anaximander's introduction of the apeiron as a fundamental principle. Anaximander also contributed to philosophy's method. He showed that philosophical progress involves finding contradictions in previous theories and proposing new theories that avoid those contradictions. Thales said everything is water, but that leads to contradictions about opposites. Anaximander proposed the apeiron to avoid those contradictions. This dialectical method, moving from thesis to antithesis to synthesis through rational criticism, became characteristic of philosophical inquiry. The move from Thales to Anaximander, from water to the apeiron, exemplifies philosophy's trajectory. It starts with familiar things, and through rational reflection moves to increasingly abstract principles. It questions what seems obvious and proposes what seems strange. It values logical consistency over intuitive plausibility. It seeks understanding through reason rather than through authority or tradition. Anaximander lived in Miletus during its peak as an intellectual center. He was roughly contemporary with Thales and teacher to Anaximenes. The three together founded natural philosophy, establishing that nature can be understood through observation and reason. Anaximander's particular contribution was showing that what's fundamental might be radically unlike what appears on the surface, that reality's deepest truths require abstract thought rather than just careful observation. His emphasis on the infinite and indefinite as fundamental may reflect psychological or spiritual intuitions as much as logical reasoning. The idea that particular separate things emerge from and return to an undifferentiated unity resonates with mystical traditions across cultures. Whether Anaximander's apeiron was purely philosophical concept or also had religious or spiritual significance is impossible to determine from surviving evidence. What we can say is that around 600 BCE in Miletus, Anaximander proposed that reality is fundamentally the apeiron, something infinite, eternal, and indefinite. This abstract principle, known only through reasoning, generates the cosmos we experience. This was a bold philosophical move that helped establish philosophy's characteristic method, using reason to discover truths that aren't obvious from ordinary experience, proposing abstract principles to explain concrete phenomena, and valuing logical consistency even when it leads to counterintuitive conclusions. The Fragments That Remain. When we read the pre-Socratic philosophers, we're reading fragments, not fragments in the sense of incomplete thoughts, but literal fragments, sentences and paragraphs quoted by later authors, preserved by chance across 2,500 years. Most of what these thinkers wrote is simply gone. What survives is like finding a few pages from a burned library and trying to reconstruct entire books from them. The fragmentary nature of pre-Socratic philosophy creates unique challenges and opportunities. On one hand, we can never fully know what these philosophers actually said. On the other hand, the fragments that survive are often the most striking passages, the ones later authors thought worth quoting. We get concentrated philosophy, the memorable lines that captured something essential. How did these fragments survive? The process was haphazard. Ancient philosophers like Aristotle quoted their predecessors when discussing philosophical problems. Aristotle's works survived, so his quotes from earlier thinkers survived with them. Later compilers created collections of philosophical opinions, doxographies, which preserved summaries and occasional quotes. Church fathers quoted pagan philosophers to criticize them or to show that pagans anticipated Christian truth. Commentators on Aristotle and Plato quoted earlier thinkers to explain references. Each stage of transmission introduced potential error. Aristotle might misrepresent predecessors, making them seem more like himself or more foolish. Doxographers might confuse similar views or attribute statements to wrong people. Copyists might make errors transcribing texts. Church fathers might quote out of context to make philosophers seem more or less compatible with Christianity. We're reading not the original text, but reports, summaries, and quotes filtered through multiple layers of interpretation. The amount surviving varies dramatically. From Heraclitus, we have about 140 fragments, many just one sentence. From Parmenides, we have about 150 lines of poetry, including some extended passages. From Empedocles, we have about 450 lines from 2 poems. These are substantial remains, allowing detailed interpretation. From other thinkers, we have almost nothing. From Thales, we have no direct quotes, only reports of what he supposedly said. From Anaximander, we have one sentence. This uneven survival creates a distorted picture of early philosophy. We know more about Heraclitus than Thales, not because Heraclitus was more important, but because more quotes happened to survive. We can analyze Parmenides' arguments in detail, but can only reconstruct Anaximenes' views from summaries. Historical importance and textual survival don't correlate. The fragments are numbered according to standard editions. Scholars cite them by number. Heraclitus fragment B22, Parmenides fragment B8. These numbers don't reflect original order. They're organizational tools modern scholars created. The fragments reached us scattered across different sources, and nobody knows how they fit together in the original works. Some fragments are obvious quotes. They're in poetic meter or use distinctive vocabulary different from the quoting author's style. Others are paraphrases or summaries where the quoting author puts pre-Socratic ideas in his own words. Sometimes it's unclear whether we're reading the pre-Socratics' actual words or a later author's interpretation. Scholars use fragment for direct quotes and testimony for indirect reports, but the boundary is often fuzzy. The interpretive challenge is severe. Imagine having one sentence from Einstein. God does not play dice with the universe. Could you reconstruct relativity theory from that? You'd know Einstein had views about determinism and divine nature, but you couldn't figure out time dilation or curved space-time. That's roughly our situation with many pre-Socratics. We have memorable lines, but lack the context and arguments that gave them meaning. Sometimes multiple sources report the same idea differently. One says Heraclitus claimed you can't step in the same river twice. Another says you can't step in the same river once. A third says we both step and don't step in the same rivers. Are these alternative versions of one saying? Different sayings making related points? Errors in transmission? We can't be certain. The poetic fragments pose special problems. Parmenides and Empedocles wrote in dactylic hexameter, Homer's meter. This was unusual for philosophy. Writing in meter means choosing words partly for sound and rhythm, not just meaning. It creates ambiguity. Did they choose a particular word because it precisely expresses their idea or because it fits the meter? When interpreting, should we analyze every word carefully or allow that some choices were poetic rather than philosophical? Despite these problems, fragments often preserve brilliant philosophy. Heraclitus's paradoxical statements about unity of opposites and constant change capture genuine insights about reality and language. Parmenides' logical arguments about being and non-being remain challenging. Empedocles' cosmic cycle driven by love and strife is memorable and substantive. The fragments work as philosophy even without full context. Modern scholars have developed sophisticated methods for working with fragments. They compare different sources quoting the same passage to establish most reliable text. They analyze vocabulary and style to determine what's likely authentic quote versus paraphrase. They study the quoting author's purposes to understand potential bias. They compare fragments from one thinker to reconstruct systematic philosophy. This work is like archaeological reconstruction, piecing together structure from scattered remains. New fragments occasionally surface. Papyrus discoveries in Egypt have yielded previously unknown texts. The most famous case is Empedocles' substantial new fragments were published in the 20th century from papyri found at Oxyrhynchus. These confirmed some interpretations and challenged others. Every new discovery changes our understanding because our evidence is so limited that adding even a few sentences matters. Technology now helps read damaged papyri. Multispectral imaging can reveal text in burned or faded scrolls. The Herculaneum papyri, carbonized when Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, are gradually being read using advanced imaging. Most contain works by Philodemus, an Epicurean, but might include other material. There's hope of discovering more ancient philosophy as technology improves. The fragmentary nature affects how we read Pre-Socratics. We focus on individual striking statements rather than systematic theories. We admire aphoristic wisdom. Everything flows. You can't step in the same river twice. Man is the measure of all things. These memorable phrases capture philosophical insight in concentrated form. They work as philosophy, even detached from original context. This aphoristic quality influenced later philosophy. Nietzsche consciously adopted pre-Socratic style, writing in fragments and aphorisms rather than systematic treatises. Wittgenstein's later philosophy consists of numbered remarks rather than continuous argument. Both were partly inspired by pre-Socratic fragments, which showed that philosophy can be done in brief, provocative statements rather than only through lengthy, systematic exposition. The gaps in our knowledge create room for interpretation and imagination. Scholars can propose different reconstructions of pre-Socratic thought because evidence is limited. This makes pre-Socratic philosophy particularly interesting philosophically. We're not just studying what they said, but thinking about what they might have meant, what arguments they might have given, how fragments might fit together. We're doing philosophy with them, not just about them. The loss of so much ancient literature is tragedy. The Alexandrian library probably contained complete works by pre-Socratics. If it hadn't burned, we might have Heraclitus's full book, all of Democritus's 300 scrolls, Pythagoras's complete works. We've lost more than we have. The intellectual heritage that survived is a tiny fraction of what existed, yet what survives is remarkable. These fragments, preserved by chance through catastrophes and cultural transformations, transmit wisdom across millennia. A sentence written in 6th century BCE Miletus, copied by hand through generations, translated into Latin and Arabic, printed in Renaissance, digitized today, still provokes thought. The ideas remain alive, even though the original texts are gone. Pythagoras' silence. Pythagoras never wrote anything down. This wasn't accident or oversight. It was deliberate policy. The Pythagoreans maintained that the most important teachings couldn't be written, but had to be transmitted orally, directly from teacher to student within the community bound by secrecy. This silence, this refusal to write, created a peculiar historical situation where one of the most influential ancient philosophers is also one of the most mysterious. The reasons for this silence are unclear and disputed. One explanation emphasizes the sacred nature of Pythagorean teachings. Writing profanes sacred knowledge by making it accessible to the uninitiated. Important truths require preparation to understand. Revealing them prematurely to unprepared minds is harmful, like giving strong medicine to someone who doesn't need it. Oral transmission allows teachers to judge when students are ready and to adapt explanations to individual capacity. Another explanation focuses on the communal nature of Pythagorean life. The teachings belong to the community, not to individuals. Writing a book would mean claiming individual ownership of collective wisdom. It would break the bonds of community by allowing outsiders access without initiation. Oral tradition keeps knowledge within the group, maintaining boundaries between insiders and outsiders. There's also practical consideration. Writing fixes ideas permanently, but understanding develops. What you write at one stage of understanding might seem inadequate or wrong later. Oral teaching remains flexible. You can adapt, refine, respond to questions, correct misunderstandings in real time. Writing loses this flexibility. Once words are written, they say the same thing to everyone, regardless of whether anyone understands. Plato makes this point in the Phaedrus, where Socrates criticizes writing. Written words seem alive and intelligent, but if you ask them questions, they just repeat the same thing. A living teacher can answer questions, clarify confusions, judge whether students understand. Writing creates illusion of knowledge without genuine understanding. This critique may reflect Pythagorean influence, since Plato was influenced by Pythagoreans and initially considered not writing his own philosophy. The irony is that Plato did write extensively while continuing to claim that the most important teachings can't be written. His dialogues show Socrates questioning and teaching through conversation, not through written lectures. Plato apparently thought dialogue form partially overcomes writing's limitations by showing philosophical conversation rather than stating conclusions. But even dialogues are fixed texts that can't respond to readers' questions. Pythagoras' silence meant that everything we know about him comes from later reports. Some were written by Pythagoreans who violated the prohibition against writing, like Philolaos in the 5th century BCE. Others were written by non-Pythagoreans like Aristotle, who described Pythagorean doctrines without being members of the community. All of these sources came generations or centuries after Pythagoras died. This creates severe historical problems. We can't distinguish what Pythagoras himself taught from what later Pythagoreans added. Ancient sources often attribute everything to Pythagoras or the Pythagoreans without specifying individual contributions. The tradition of crediting all discoveries to the founder, even discoveries made generations later, was Pythagorean practice. This honored Pythagoras, but obscured historical development. Aristotle was aware of this problem. He usually refers to the Pythagoreans rather than Pythagoras himself, acknowledging that he's describing the school's doctrines without claiming they originated with the founder. Later writers were less careful. They confidently attributed specific teachings and events to Pythagoras personally, even when they had no reliable information about what he actually did or said. The silence also enabled legend to grow. Without written records to constrain interpretation, stories about Pythagoras multiplied. He could remember his past lives. He could be in two places at once. He had a golden thigh. Animals obeyed him. He performed miracles. How much of this was believed by Pythagoreans, how much was outsiders' mockery, and how much was hagiography written centuries later is impossible to determine. Some scholars think Pythagoras was primarily a religious teacher whose mathematical and philosophical teachings were added by later followers. Others think he was a genuine philosopher and mathematician whose religious activities were exaggerated by later admirers. Still others think he was fraud and charlatan who founded a cult through charisma and deception. The lack of contemporary evidence makes all these positions defensible. The Pythagorean policy of silence continued for centuries. Even when Pythagoreans began writing, they maintained some secrecy. Philolaus, who wrote in the late 5th century, apparently revealed some teachings, but not all Architas of Tarentum in the 4th century wrote on mathematics and politics, but perhaps not on esoteric doctrines. The tradition of oral transmission parallel to written works continued. This dual tradition, public and private teachings, influenced later philosophy. Aristotle apparently distinguished esoteric works for students from exoteric works for general public. The esoteric works survived, while the published dialogues were lost, reversing the usual pattern. Neoplatonists later distinguished levels of teaching, with the deepest truths reserved for advanced students. This hierarchical pedagogy traces partly to Pythagorean precedent. Early Christianity adopted similar practices. Jesus taught openly, but also had private teachings for disciples. Paul speaks of wisdom for the mature versus milk for babies. Gnostic Christians claimed secret teachings transmitted orally from apostles. The tension between public preaching and esoteric knowledge in Christianity may have been influenced by philosophical precedents, including Pythagoreanism. The question of whether important truths can be written remains philosophically interesting. Wittgenstein ended the Tractatus by saying, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent," suggesting some truths lie beyond language. Zen Buddhism emphasizes direct transmission, mind to mind, outside scriptures. Various mystical traditions claim the deepest experiences can't be captured in words. The counter-argument is that refusing to write is elitist and obscurantist. It creates artificial hierarchy between those with access to secret knowledge and those without. It prevents critical examination because doctrines aren't stated clearly enough to analyze. It allows charlatans to claim deep wisdom while saying nothing substantive. Writing, despite its limitations, enables ideas to be examined, criticized, and developed by wider community. Pythagoras' silence has another consequence. It makes him eternally mysterious and intriguing. Philosophers we know through extensive writings become familiar, we understand their arguments, and can criticize their weaknesses. But Pythagoras remains enigmatic. What did he really teach? What did he really discover? What was he really like? The silence creates space for imagination and projection. This may be fitting for someone who apparently believed that ultimate reality is mathematical and that understanding requires purification and initiation. Mathematics is discovered through reason, not revealed in words. Mathematical truth is independent of who discovers it or how it's expressed. Perhaps Pythagoras thought philosophical truth is similar. What matters is achieving understanding, not recording doctrines. The silence forces each person to discover truth directly rather than accepting it on authority. Or perhaps the silence was simply practical. In an oral culture where literacy was limited and books were expensive, oral teaching was normal. The Pythagorean prohibition against writing may have codified existing practice rather than reflecting deep philosophical conviction. The reasons later authors gave for the silence may have been rationalizations, finding philosophical justification for what was originally just cultural habit. We'll never know for certain. Pythagoras kept his silence, and his followers mostly kept it for him. What broke the silence were outsiders like Aristotle and later Pythagoreans who chose to write by then. Centuries had passed, and what Pythagoras actually said had been transformed by legend, elaboration, and reinterpretation. The historical Pythagoras is lost behind the silence he chose. What remains is influence without clear source. mathematical discoveries without provable inventor, philosophical positions without certain originator, the silence accomplished one thing: it made Pythagoras immortal by making him unknowable. The Trial of Anaxagoras. Around 450 BCE, Athens prosecuted Anaxagoras for impiety. The charges were that he denied the gods and taught that the sun is a hot stone and the moon is made of earth. This trial established a dangerous precedent. Natural philosophy could be treated as a religious crime. Explaining celestial phenomena through natural causes rather than divine action could get you exiled or executed. Anaxagoras had come to Athens from Clazomenae in Asia Minor around 480 BCE. He was the first major philosopher to work in Athens, bringing Ionian natural philosophy to what would become the intellectual center of Greece. He taught that everything contains portions of everything else, that mind or now organize the cosmos, and that celestial bodies are not gods but natural objects. This last teaching got him in trouble. The traditional Greek view held that the sun was the god Helios driving his chariot across the sky. The moon was the goddess Selene. Stars were divine beings. To say the sun is a hot stone larger than the Peloponnese, that the moon shines by reflected sunlight and has mountains and valleys like earth, that eclipses occur through natural alignment of celestial bodies, this was to deny the gods. At least, that's how prosecutors framed it. The prosecution was politically motivated. Anaxagoras was close to Pericles, Athens' leading statesman. Pericles had studied with Anaxagoras and credited him with teaching clear thinking and effective speaking. Attacking Pericles directly was difficult because of his popularity and power. Attacking his associates was safer. If you couldn't bring down Pericles himself, you could damage his reputation by prosecuting his teacher for atheism. The political context matters. Athens in this period was experiencing tension between traditional religious values and new intellectual movements. The Sophists were teaching rhetorical techniques and questioning conventional morality. Philosophers were proposing naturalistic explanations for phenomena traditionally attributed to gods. Playwrights like Euripides were presenting religious skepticism on stage. Conservative Athenians saw this as dangerous impiety threatening social order. The specific prosecutor was apparently Cleon, a political rival of Pericles, though sources disagree on details. The charge of impiety was flexible enough to use against almost any intellectual who questioned traditional beliefs. It didn't require proving someone denied gods existed, only that they didn't honor the city's gods properly or introduce new divinities. Socrates would face similar charges 50 years later. What exactly constituted impiety was deliberately vague. The law protected traditional religion, but didn't define precisely what that meant. This vagueness made the charge useful for political purposes. Anyone who taught controversial ideas could potentially be prosecuted. The ambiguity meant that enforcement depended on political climate and popular opinion rather than clear legal standards. Anaxagoras apparently tried to defend himself by distinguishing his views from atheism. He believed in mind as cosmic intelligence. This wasn't denying divinity, but reconceiving it. The sun isn't the god Helios, but the cosmos is ordered by divine intelligence. This distinction was too subtle for the court, or the prosecution deliberately obscured it. Saying the sun is a rock sounded like atheism, regardless of what else you believed. According to different accounts, Anaxagoras was either convicted and exiled or fled Athens before the verdict. He went to Lampsacus, a Greek city on the Hellespont, where he founded a school and lived until his death around 428 BCE. The city honored him afterward, establishing an annual holiday for children in his memory. So while Athens rejected him, elsewhere he was respected. The trial had lasting effects. It showed that philosophers in Athens risked prosecution for their teachings. This probably made philosophers more cautious about explicitly denying traditional religion. It may explain why Socrates, despite being skeptical about anthropomorphic gods, always spoke respectfully of divinity and claimed to follow divine guidance through his daimonion. The trial also revealed tension between philosophy and democracy. Democratic Athens valued free speech and intellectual inquiry, but it also valued traditional religion and social cohesion. When these values conflicted, which took precedence? The Anaxagoras trial suggested that intellectual freedom had limits. You could question and investigate, but not if doing so threatened religious foundations of social order. Plato later criticized Athenian democracy, partly because it prosecuted philosophers. The trial and execution of Socrates confirmed this criticism. A system where popular opinion determines guilt or innocence of intellectual activity seemed fundamentally flawed to Plato. It suggested that democracy was incompatible with philosophy, that rule by the many would always suppress rule by the wise. But the trial wasn't simply democracy versus philosophy. The prosecution was politically motivated, using impiety charges to attack Pericles, Many Athenians probably didn't care whether the sun was a god or a rock. They cared about political power, factional advantage, and personal rivalries. Religion was the weapon, not the cause. This pattern of using religious charges for political purposes appears throughout history. Accuse your enemy of heresy, blasphemy, or impiety, and you can destroy them while claiming to defend sacred values. The actual beliefs may be irrelevant. What matters is that the charge is serious enough and vague enough to use against anyone you want to harm. Anaxagoras' teachings weren't particularly radical by later philosophical standards. Most philosophers after him accepted that celestial bodies are natural objects. Aristotle developed detailed astronomy treating sun, moon, and planets as physical entities. But Aristotle worked in different political context, and he was more careful about how he framed his ideas in relation to traditional religion. The trial raises questions about limits of free inquiry. Should any ideas be off limits? If teaching certain doctrines threatens social stability, can society legitimately suppress them? Who decides which ideas are dangerous? These questions remain relevant. Modern debates about hate speech, misinformation, and academic freedom echo ancient disputes about whether and how to limit expression. Anaxagoras himself apparently maintained his views despite prosecution. He didn't recant or apologize. He stood by his claim that the sun is a hot stone and the moon is earth-like. This intellectual integrity cost him his position in Athens, but earned respect elsewhere. He showed that philosophy sometimes requires courage, that discovering and teaching truth may conflict with social expectations and legal requirements. The trial also demonstrates how fragile intellectual progress is. Athens in Heraclitus' time was remarkably open to new ideas. Yet even then, political pressure and religious conservatism could suppress natural philosophy. After Athens lost the Peloponnesian War and democracy was temporarily overthrown, the climate became even more repressive. The execution of Socrates showed that the Anaxagoras trial wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern. What's striking is that Anaxagoras was right. The sun is a hot object, not a god driving a chariot. The moon does shine by reflected light. Eclipses do occur through natural alignment of celestial bodies. He reached these conclusions through reasoning and observation, not through revelation or tradition. He was prosecuted for teaching truth that conflicted with mythology. This is what makes the trial of Anaxagoras emblematic. Throughout history, people who challenge prevailing beliefs with evidence and reasoning face resistance. The resistance takes different forms in different societies, but the pattern repeats. New knowledge threatens established authority. Those who teach new knowledge face consequences. Sometimes they're vindicated eventually, but often not in their lifetimes. Anaxagoras lived another 20-some years after leaving Athens. He continued teaching and investigating nature. He apparently held no bitterness. When asked how he felt about being exiled from Athens, he supposedly said that it was Athens that was deprived of him, not he of Athens. Whether this story is true or invented to show philosophical composure, it captures appropriate attitude. Truth doesn't depend on whether anyone accepts it. Zeno of Elea's 40 Paradoxes. According to Plato, Zeno of Elea wrote a book containing 40 paradoxes. We have detailed accounts of only 4, all concerning motion. The others are lost. We know they existed because ancient sources mention them, sometimes describing their subjects briefly, but we don't have the arguments. This loss is significant because Zeno's method of arguing through paradox influenced philosophy profoundly, and we're missing most examples of his work. The 4 surviving paradoxes about motion, the dichotomy, Achilles and the tortoise, the arrow, and the stadium, show Zeno's brilliance at finding contradictions in common sense beliefs. The lost paradoxes apparently addressed other topics using similar methods. Some concerned plurality, arguing that belief in many things leads to contradictions. Others addressed perception, space, or other philosophical problems. Reconstructing them from brief references is like reconstructing a building from scattered bricks. One lost paradox concerned the millet seed. This is mentioned by Aristotle and later commentators, but not fully explained. Apparently, Zeno argued something like this. A single millet seed makes no sound when it falls. 1,000 millet seeds make a sound when they fall. But 1,000 seeds is just many individual seeds. If each individual seed makes no sound, how can many together make sound? Something can't come from nothing. Sound can't arise from no sound. This leads to contradiction. The paradox raises genuine problems about emergence and thresholds. When does quantity produce qualitative change? At what point do soundless impacts become sound? Modern physics would say that sound is vibration in air, and a single seed produces vibration too small to hear. Many seeds together produce enough vibration to cross the hearing threshold, but Zeno's point about emergence remains interesting. How do properties at one level arise from properties at another level? Another lost paradox concerned the stadium or moving rows. Ancient descriptions of this are confusing and contradictory. It apparently involved 3 rows of objects, 1 stationary and 2 moving in opposite directions at the same speed. Zeno argued that this leads to contradictory conclusions about how much time has passed or how much distance was covered. Without the full argument, interpreting this is guesswork. Some paradoxes addressed plurality directly. If there are many things, they must be both limited and unlimited in number. Limited because they are as many as they are, no more and no fewer. Unlimited because between any 2 things, there must be another thing separating them, and between that separator and each original thing must be another separator, continuing infinitely. This argues that the common sense belief in many distinct things leads to contradiction. Another argument about plurality said that if there are many things, they must be both infinitely small and infinitely large. Infinitely small because if they have magnitude, they can be divided infinitely, and each division yields something with magnitude, leading to infinite regress. But also infinitely large because if there are infinitely many parts, each with some magnitude, the sum is infinite. This shows that the concept of many extended things involves contradiction. These arguments about plurality were apparently designed to defend Parmenides' claim that reality is one. If believing in many things leads to contradictions, and believing in one thing doesn't, then reason compels us to believe reality is one. Zeno wasn't proposing his own positive philosophy, but defending his teacher Parmenides by showing that the alternative, pluralism, is logically incoherent. Some lost paradoxes apparently addressed sense perception. If perception is reliable, various contradictions follow. The tower that looks round from a distance but square up close can't be both round and square. The stick that looks bent in water but straight in air can't be both bent and straight. These contradictions suggest perception is unreliable. We shouldn't trust senses to tell us about reality. This skepticism about perception influenced later philosophy. The Sophists used similar arguments to support relativism. Plato used them to argue that the physical world known through senses is less real than the intelligible world known through reason. Skeptics in the Hellenistic period developed extensive arguments showing that senses contradict each other and therefore can't provide knowledge. Other paradoxes may have addressed mathematical concepts. Ancient sources mention Zeno arguing about points, lines, and infinite divisibility. Some of these arguments may have been versions of the dichotomy paradox applied to spatial division rather than motion. Others may have raised different problems about mathematical entities and their relationship to physical reality. Why were these paradoxes lost? Partly because Zeno's book itself was lost. We have no complete ancient philosophical texts from before the 4th century BCE. Everything earlier survives only as fragments and reports. Later authors quoted the paradoxes they found most interesting or relevant to their own concerns. The motion paradoxes were frequently discussed because they raised profound problems. Other paradoxes, perhaps addressing less central issues or using technical arguments that were harder to explain briefly, were mentioned less often and eventually forgotten. The loss is frustrating because Zeno apparently pioneered a method of arguing through reductio ad absurdum, showing that a position leads to contradiction. This became a standard tool in philosophy and mathematics. Having more examples of Zeno's arguments would illuminate both his method and the range of problems he addressed. We could better understand how he thought and how he defended Parmenides. Some scholars have attempted to reconstruct lost paradoxes from brief mentions in ancient sources. This requires careful philology, analyzing exactly what ancient authors say and considering what arguments might have generated those brief descriptions, but reconstruction is necessarily speculative. Different scholars propose different reconstructions, and there's no way to verify which, if any, matches what Zeno actually wrote. The 40 paradoxes might not all have been equally sophisticated or important. Zeno may have included some arguments that were variations on themes or applications of similar reasoning to different cases. Ancient authors would naturally quote the most striking or challenging arguments, leaving weaker ones unreported. So the lost paradoxes might have been less philosophically significant than the surviving ones, or the opposite might be true. Perhaps Zeno's most devastating arguments are lost, and we have only the ones that later philosophers found less threatening or easier to address. If Zeno had a killer argument that nobody could answer, later tradition might have suppressed it by not copying it. This is speculative, but it shows how the survival of texts is not random, and how what survives may not be representative. What we can say is that Zeno wrote systematically, producing 40 arguments defending Parmenides' monism by showing that alternatives lead to contradiction. He addressed motion, plurality, perception, mathematics, and probably other topics. His arguments were clever enough and troubling enough that philosophers 2,000 years later still discuss them, but most of his work is gone, known only through brief mentions that tantalize without satisfying. The survival of only 4 paradoxes creates a distorted picture of Zeno as purely concerned with motion. He was apparently interested in broader metaphysical and epistemological questions. The motion paradoxes are famous because they're counterintuitive and because they challenge something everyone believes is real. But Zeno's project was more comprehensive than attacking belief in motion. He was defending a radical metaphysical position through systematic logical argument. The lost paradoxes represent lost philosophy that might have enriched subsequent thought. If medieval or Renaissance philosophers had access to more Zenonian arguments, they might have developed different solutions or taken different philosophical directions. Every lost text is a road not taken, possibilities foreclosed. We can't know what we've lost, which makes the loss both tragic and irrecoverable. The burning of the library. When people speak of the burning of the library, they usually mean the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. Founded in the 3rd century BCE, it was the largest collection of texts in the ancient world. It probably held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, including works by philosophers, scientists, poets, historians, and dramaticians from throughout the Mediterranean world. At some point, much or all of it was destroyed. Exactly when, how, and how much was lost remains unclear and disputed. The library was founded by Ptolemy I, or his son Ptolemy II, Greek rulers of Egypt after Alexander the Great's empire fragmented. The Ptolemies wanted to make Alexandria a cultural center rivaling Athens. They built the library and the museum, a research institute where scholars were supported to study and write. They aggressively acquired texts, reportedly confiscating books from ships entering Alexandria's harbor, copying them, and returning copies while keeping originals. The collection included complete works by philosophers, whose writings are now fragmentary or lost. All of Aristotle's published dialogues were there, Democritus's 300 scrolls. Complete works by Epicurus, by Pre-Socratics, by Sophists, by countless thinkers we know only as names, or not at all. The library contained not just Greek texts, but also works translated from Egyptian, Persian, Jewish, and other traditions. It was comprehensive by ancient standards. What happened to it is complicated and controversial. Ancient sources describe multiple incidents of destruction. Julius Caesar may have accidentally burned part of the library in 48 BCE during his military operations in Alexandria. This account comes from later sources and may be exaggerated or confused with burning ships in the harbor. The main library building probably survived Caesar, though some texts may have been lost. The daughter library in the Temple of Serapis was destroyed in 391 CE when Christian mobs, encouraged by Patriarch Theophilus, attacked pagan temples. This destruction was deliberate, part of Christian campaign against paganism. How many texts were in the Serapeum and whether they included irreplaceable material is unknown. Some sources suggest the collection had already declined by this point. Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 CE led to another story. According to a late and probably unreliable account, the Caliph Omar ordered the library's remaining books burned, saying that if they agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were harmful. This story appears centuries after the events and is doubted by most historians. The library had probably already been destroyed or dispersed by the 7th century. The reality is that the library declined gradually rather than being destroyed in a single dramatic event. Ancient libraries faced constant challenges, scrolls deteriorated and needed copying. Wars disrupted funding and patronage. Political instability affected scholarly community. Christian emperors from the 4th century onward were hostile to pagan learning. The library probably shrank over centuries through neglect, deliberate destruction, and failure to maintain and copy texts. But the Library of Alexandria wasn't the only library lost. The library at Pergamum, the second largest in antiquity, was given to Cleopatra by Mark Antony, and probably suffered similar fate as Alexandria's collection, Aristotle's library, inherited by his successor Theophrastus, was hidden and damaged before being eventually taken to Rome. Rome's libraries burned during various fires and the collapse of imperial power. Constantinople's libraries suffered through wars, iconoclasm, and the Fourth Crusade's sack of the city in 1204. The cumulative loss was staggering. Scholars estimate we have less than 10% of ancient Greek literature, perhaps much less. We have 7 plays by Sophocles from an original 127, by Aeschylus from 90, 19 by Euripides from 92. These were the lucky ones whose works were used in schools and therefore copied repeatedly. Authors whose works weren't pedagogically useful had worse survival rates. For philosophy, the loss was severe but uneven. Plato's dialogues survived relatively well because they were studied continuously. Aristotle's lecture notes survived while his published works were lost. Epicurean philosophy survived partly through Lucretius's Latin poem, and partly through papyri from Herculaneum. Stoic philosophy survived through later Roman Stoics, but many philosophers disappeared almost entirely. We know dozens of names from ancient catalogues of philosophers, but we have nothing or almost nothing of their work. The Pre-Socratics suffered particularly heavy losses. They wrote before Athens became the philosophical center, so their works weren't incorporated into Athenian educational tradition. They wrote in Ionic dialect rather than Attic, making them seem archaic to later readers. They proposed views that were superseded by later philosophy, reducing interest in reading them. All of these factors meant fewer copies were made, making survival less likely. The loss of context is as significant as loss of texts. We have some fragments from pre-Socratics, but little information about how they lived, who they taught, what questions motivated them, how their contemporaries received their ideas. We read them in isolation, extracted from the intellectual world that gave them meaning. This makes interpretation difficult and speculative. Scientific and mathematical works suffered severe losses. Ancient mathematics was highly sophisticated, but much is lost. Archimedes wrote multiple works, most lost until medieval Arabic translations preserved some. Apollonius's conics survives only partly. Countless other mathematical works are known only by title or not at all. Scientific observation and experimentation, medicine, engineering, all these fields produce texts that mostly vanished. Why did so much disappear? Partly because copying by hand was expensive and labor-intensive. Decisions about what to copy determined what survived texts useful for education or religious purposes got copied. Others didn't. Christian scribes preserved some pagan philosophy, but not all. They copied texts that seemed compatible with Christianity, or that could be used to refute paganism. They ignored or actively destroyed texts promoting polytheism, materialism, or atheism. Natural disasters played a role. Fires destroyed libraries repeatedly. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE burned libraries. Multiple fires damaged Alexandria's libraries. Constantinople burned repeatedly. Earthquakes, floods, and wars destroyed collections. Each loss was irreversible. Once all copies of a text were gone, it was gone forever. The shift from scroll to codex, from papyrus to parchment, and later from manuscript to print, created opportunities for loss. Each technological transition required recopying texts that weren't recopied at each transition disappeared. The shift from ancient to medieval culture was particularly devastating. The collapse of Roman infrastructure, the decline in literacy, the chaos of migration period, all of this disrupted the transmission of texts. The loss continues to be discovered. When scholars identify that an ancient author wrote works we don't have, or when fragments surface showing views we didn't know about, we realize again how much is missing. The Herculaneum papyri have yielded some previously unknown works, reminding us that chance discoveries can recover lost texts, but most losses are permanent. What we've lost represents alternative intellectual paths, different ways of thinking, questions we don't know were asked. If we had Aristotle's dialogues, would we understand him differently? If we had all of Democritus, would atomism have seemed more sophisticated? If we had more Sophists, would we view them less negatively? We can't answer these questions, which is precisely what makes the loss so profound. The burning of the library, understood as the cumulative loss of ancient texts through multiple causes over many centuries, represents one of the great intellectual tragedies in human history. We build on the foundation of Greek philosophy, but we're building on ruins. Most of the foundation is gone. We work with what happened to survive through chance, through decisions made by people with different values and interests than ours, through accidents of history. The philosophy we have is not the philosophy that existed, it's the remnant that survived catastrophe.